In 2003, Hironobu Sakaguchi unleashed a huge shock within the video game industry when it was announced that he had left Square Enix to restart his life as a game developer with the creation of his newest development studio called Mistwalker Studios in Honolulu, Hawaii. For 2 decades, Sakaguchi was a very important and leading individual who was responsible for bringing Square out of the initial risk of closure because of the groundbreaking success he brought forth with the creation of the Final Fantasy IP, and led them into a prosperous future where the intellectual property became the company's flagship franchise for their business. During his time as a full-time developer, he would be busy with working mainly on the Final Fantasy series on a yearly basis, since the original game began development in 1987 as Square's Director of Planning and Development in 1986, and the continual success of every new game in the series eventually led to Sakaguchi becoming the company's Executive Vice President in 1991. Outside of his work on those games, Sakaguchi was an aggressive businessman, as he still managed to continue Square's impressive track record with the groundbreaking successes of the Final Fantasy series while overseeing, supervising, and producing a number of other games for the company when other games started to attribute to its good fortune. His job at Square was to continue working on new installments of Final Fantasy while overseeing other projects and conceiving new ideas for more original IPs to continuously build up the company's portfolio of intellectual properties in order to make a name for itself. With so much success that the games created by Square, and leading them to a bigger name and entity within the video game industry, most of it was thanks to Hironobu Sakaguchi's business practices during his time as Square's Executive Vice President. His job with being a producer, executive producer, and supervisor on many of those games successfully brought each game an impressive amount of quality to each new experience that was conceived. In that sense, those games that Sakaguchi had a part in could become memorable to the eyes of the public for many generations to come. For having such an impressive rap sheet with many of the games he would oversee and supervise during his time amongst the company's corporate structure, Sakaguchi would be promoted to the president of Square's North American division in Los Angeles, California within the United States. During his time within the North American division, Hironobu Sakaguchi would not only be responsible for his continued support on many of the games done back in Japan, with him mostly working as an executive producer, but it became his responsibility to bring about many of those games to the overseas market, mainly the United States, as a way to continue attributing Square's appeal toward a worldwide audience. Much of the success of the original PlayStation was thanks to people like Hironobu Sakaguchi and the company Square for releasing games such as Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, and Final Fantasy IX, as well as other hits such as Xenogears, Parasite Eve, Brave Fencer Musashi, Vagrant Story, and many others that held as much appeal as those that were seen during the company's golden age of RPGs released on both the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom. Even with that much impressive output on his part for Square, Sakaguchi's outlook on the company's future would not be the same when he worked on the company's first film, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. The movie became one of the most expensive films that was ever created at the time of around $137 million due to it being developed as a CGI film in mind. Even though its reviews were mixed to okay by both the general public and critics, Square as a whole ended up losing over $120 million in their overall bank, which led them to shutting down the movie studio and reducing the company's financial capital, as they were all contributing factors to the company's first financial loss since it went public. Seeing as how catastrophic it was for Square to suffer that heavy of a loss within their business, Sakaguchi voluntarily stepped down as Square's executive vice president, as he would now just serve the company as an executive producer from that point on. Around that time, and when Final Fantasy X was nearing completion and about to release, Hironobu Sakaguchi began seeing the brighter picture of the video game industry's future, as consoles like the PlayStation 2, the original Xbox, and the Nintendo GameCube were leading the way with new technological advancements over what was seen in the past, that the thresholds in game development were much higher than before. In wanting to take advantage of this outcome and start his career in game development all over again, Sakaguchi sought in wanting to create a new game development studio under his name so that he can continue his philosophy on how he creates video games in his way. Thus, it was around that time in 2001 when Sakaguchi registered and trademarked both the name and logo of Mistwalker, as that would be his first step in wanting to start his own company. However, it wasn't just Hironobu Sakaguchi who ended up stepping down from his position and eventually leaving the company outright, as others who worked closely with him made their own headlines over the years. The founder of Square, Masafumi Miyamoto, became the company's president for 5 years after it went public in 1986, and he would step down and resign from the company in 1991 and be succeeded by a man named Tetsuo Mizuno in the following year. Although he resigned, Miyamoto remained as a major shareholder for the company, as him judging the outlook of Square's future played a pivotal role going forward to this very day. Hisashi Suzuki would succeed Tetsuo Mizuno as the company's president and chief executive officer in 1996, while Mizuno continued to play an executive producer role in the company's games from the business side of things, and Tomoyuki Takechi would be the chairman for Square, while Masahei Hiramatsu would be the company director. By the time when 2001 rolled around, and with Sakaguchi already changing positions due to the restructuring of Square, both Tomoyuki Takechi and Masahei Hiramatsu would be relieved from their positions to both take on consultant roles in some way, with Takechi being succeeded by the company's CFO named Yoichi Wada, to its full-on president that December. With so many of its leading individuals already gone, there would be a brand new outlook for Square's future when it came to its new management from back in Japan. The changes between staff members during the restructuring of the company and foreseeing the bigger picture in the video game industry's future meant the strong bond between Square and Hironobu Sakaguchi was coming to an end. Looking back at these changes, inside sources claim that the new management at Square just simply did not respect Sakaguchi's work ethic as the previous management used to from before, and the prospects of continuing that outlook in the company's culture would mean that the output on several of their franchises that weren't as huge as Final Fantasy would become far more limited if losses were to continue on a yearly basis. Yoichi Wada and the new management would lead Square into a new initiative as they would seek several goals to recuperate the major loss they suffered in 2001, with one of them seeking a capital injection from Sony, with the corporate enterprise purchasing the 18.6% stake into Square to reprieve them of their financial loss. Another plan that Yoichi Wada executed as Square's president was to reduce the number of formations and disbursements between teams on various projects, and to have those different teams be permanently fixed into various divisions. They also looked at minimizing the costs on creating new source codes and resources on newer games, and they instead reused them between projects to lower the time with the production of each game within those specific teams. However, the penultimate factor to Yoichi Wada's new initiative was to merge the companies of both Square and Enix into one factor, so that both of their cultures could remain alive, and their own properties could prosper even further, with newer games in both mainline and spin-offs in mind. Surprisingly, the merger between Square and Enix was not fully credited for or originated by Yoichi Wada himself. Talks of the merger between Square and Enix began as early as the year 2000, when people like Tomoyuki Takechi and Hisashi Suzuki were still around Square's corporate structure. Since it was easier in the past for Square to work on their own games from the various different IPs and collaborations they took part in, and to make the money back on those games that were put out, the higher-ups within Square began noticing the changes between higher production values with the inevitable arrival of the next generation of gaming looming around the corner. With more projects being worked on by the company, and with them pooling so much capital into the development and production of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, people like Tomoyuki Takechi and Hisashi Suzuki were becoming anxious with how game development was becoming much bigger with every passing year, as well as realizing that there was only so much that they could do if they couldn't regain the targeted revenue they seek for the sales of their games and future generations of hardware, that they felt it was the perfect time that Square sought out in acquiring and merging with other companies. Their first immediate target in seeking a merger would be Square's rival company, Enix. Knowing that Enix was a much smaller entity in game development with only a few IPs under their belt, such as Dragon Quest, Star Ocean, and Valkyrie Profile coming from themselves, Square thought it would be a capital idea for both the companies to merge together so that both of their collection of intellectual properties would be under the same banner, and putting out more games from each other would help them with attributing more gain to their yearly earnings, reduce financial risks with Square's new eventual development philosophy, and look at further avenues to their long-term growth, with eventual new IPs and other acquisitions in the future. However, those talks of a merger were placed on hold when Square's announcement of their financial failure with Final Fantasy The Spirits Within was made public. However, after the next year, and when the company's earnings were much more improved thanks to the significant sales numbers for both Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts, their financial situation retained sustainability that the talks for Square and Enix to merge would resume where they left off. Yoichi Wada described this transition where both companies were already at their height as the merger started to officially proceed. However, dissonance between Hironobu Sakaguchi and Square started to gradually take effect, as the father of Final Fantasy was starting to question Square's new business philosophy with their new direction in video game development, as well as the various criticisms that were had when the merger was in its final stages of taking place. However, the penultimate reason why Square and Enix agreed to merge with each other was mainly due to the fact that several Japanese video game companies were facing the risk of bankruptcy at the time. Continuing with how they were, if a merger wasn't even conceived by either of them, would possibly lead to them eventually facing bankruptcy themselves, and their unfortunate disappearance to both the industry and the community would deliver a huge blow to Japan's video game market and to that from overseas. Having that happen when the sales of video games made for home consoles was beginning to shrink would not be in both Square and Enix's best interest to remain independent, as they should be helping out each other during these tumultuous times. On top of which, they would seek partnerships with other publishers like Nintendo, who were responsible with releasing new games and re-releasing older titles on the Nintendo GameCube and the Game Boy Advance for the Western markets. This would happen during the time when Nintendo's current president, Satoru Iwata, was humbly trying to restore and fix the bad blood between them and companies like Square. Their shocking split was due to the dissonance that Square had with Nintendo's former president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, when the Nintendo 64 was released and continued using cartridges instead of CDs, where the capacity for each game was far more limited for the device. On April 1st, 2003, Square Enix surprised the entire gaming industry when they announced that they had merged together and had become officially known as Square Enix. This would mean that the formation of this new business would expand beyond what they were into a much bigger corporation, as more and more people were being hired and eventual new companies were being acquired by them, such as Taito and Eidos Interactive. It was around that same time or shortly after the unification when Sakaguchi would leave Square Enix and start up Mistwalker Studios in Honolulu, Hawaii, that was financially backed by Microsoft. Even though Hironobu Sakaguchi would remain good friends with many of his past colleagues in both the developer and publisher side of the business, such as Yoshinori Kitase, Tetsuya Nomura, Hiroyuki Ito, Hiromichi Tanaka, Akitoshi Kawazu, and many others like them, he felt that his departure was the correct choice, as him being the president and CEO of his new development studio would help him strive to continue down the path with how he wants to create games for a worldwide audience. The financial backing from Microsoft was due to people like one of the heads of the Xbox division at the time, Ed Fries, where he wanted to honorably preserve a developer's culture and to let them conceive games how they saw fit under their own eyes. This was mainly true when Ed Fries helped Microsoft acquire other companies like Bungie and Rare, as he wanted them to create the games that they saw fit, instead of the parent holder deciding what they should make them out to be. Final Fantasy X and X-2 on the PlayStation 2 showcased how strong of a dominant force that Yoshinori Kitase and his team continued to be within Square Enix. By continuing their goal of challenging the conventions of the series with experimentation of newer ideas into newer games, the track record continued to breathe life into the series, thanks to the likes of Yoshinori Kitase, Tetsuya Nomura, and Kazushige Nojima being at the forefront of the Final Fantasy franchise's future. After the release of Final Fantasy X-2 International plus Last Mission on the PlayStation 2 in Japan, and with Final Fantasy XII being worked on by Hiroyuki Ito and his own team, Yoshinori Kitase and his team would be in charge of working on the 13th installment of the series. Development for Final Fantasy XIII began in 2004, after the initial concept was thought of after Yoshinori Kitase and the team behind Final Fantasy X-2 International plus Last Mission came up with the idea during a jogging session. It was originally planned as being another PlayStation 2 title, with it representing the last game for that console generation, but it ended up being moved to the PlayStation 3 following May 2005, with the team having to start everything over from scratch. Bits of the PlayStation 2 version during its beta have surfaced online much later, where the development wasn't that too far along, as it mainly focused on creating the world and story, but no gameplay conceived. The development of Final Fantasy XIII began during a time when Square Enix started to shift towards a new console generation, and to a certain extent, had to anticipate what the future generation of gaming would be like. On top of that, the development team was also commissioned to create the Final Fantasy VII technical demo for the PlayStation 3 that was to be presented at E3 2005, and the end result came to strong praise and excitement from critics and fans. Because of its response, Final Fantasy XIII would move on to the PlayStation 3 and be the first game in the series to represent the franchise on 7th generation consoles. At the start of its development, Final Fantasy XIII would be developed under the working title Colors World, and the idea from the very start was to have a battle system that was highly action-based, and not just resorting back to the series' traditional active time battle system they are fondly known for. Yoshinori Kitase would be in charge of the development as the game's lead producer, with his longtime friend, Motomu Toriyama, being its main director. Tetsuya Nomura would be in charge as the main character designer, with Kazushige Nojima providing the scenario concept, as he would not be the full-on scenario writer like where he was during the development of both Final Fantasy X and X-2. Yoshinori Kitase and his team would fully begin with what they would conceive as the next big game in the franchise. As Final Fantasy XIII was to be expected as the next game for the Japanese RPG company, its existence would give birth to a new compilation project like what was seen for the compilation of Final Fantasy VII and the Ivalice Alliance, but at a much more ambitious scale. During the first year of Final Fantasy XIII's development, Motomu Toriyama and Kazushige Nojima were conceiving ideas for the plot. Nojima thought up of a new mythology based on the crystals, and it would become the basis of a new compilation series called Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy that included concepts such as Fal'Cie and l'Cie respectively. With Final Fantasy XIII being the ambassador of this new compilation, Toriyama created a story that would be premised on this mythology. He wanted to portray quote-unquote characters at the mercy of a predetermined unjust fate who quote-unquote belong together but collide heavily. In order to achieve this objective, Final Fantasy XIII's story became structured with more of a linear storyline that had chapters as each of them would focus on different protagonists. The middle of the story would mark the turning point of the interpersonal relationships of the party. In May 2005, and after the project was moved onto the PlayStation 3 platform, Final Fantasy XIII would be created by a new proprietary engine within Square Enix called Crystal Tools, as it could be used for many games they create on many different platforms. The Crystal Tools engine is a unified engine that combines standard libraries for graphics rendering, physics processing, motion control, cinematics, visual effects, sound, artificial intelligence, and networking. On the development side, the engine takes form of various authoring tools which focused on large-scale projects. It encompasses a character viewer for 3D models, an effects and cutscene editor, a pre-visualization tool, and a sound maker. The Crystal Tools engine also provided usage of third-party programs like Autodesk Maya, Autodesk Soft Image, and Adobe Photoshop via plugins. These individual authoring tools are connected to a server, which reads all the different data formats, processes them, and gives them an instant preview of the final game. It is highly customizable and can be expanded with new functions and tools should the need for them arise. Although Crystal Tools allows for easier cross-platform development, certain programming areas would need to be adjusted, such as video memory and processor architecture, to necessitate fine-tuning adjustments such as texture sizes in games. Based on this new game development software, it would help Square Enix easily see how the game would shape up, based on preview samples of everything being processed all into one, without working in separate departments to try and import everything at once. Square Enix believed that using this new proprietary engine would help speed up Final Fantasy XIII's development later in the project, since the standards of video game development were evolving into larger-scale projects than what they were normally comfortable with. In March 2006, and continuing with the development of the game's narrative with its structural parts starting to come together, lead scenario writer Daisuke Watanabe from Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII also joined in on the project. Toriyama gave Watanabe a rough outline of the plot that covered over the first half of the game, which included several cornerstone scenes that needed to be kept, like when party members were separated or reunited. He also told Watanabe what he wanted to express with the scenario and asked him to flesh out the story and to strengthen how the points in his outline would manage to connect. Watanabe, in return, had to decide about how certain scenes were to play out and then write the scenario in that way. To this end, Watanabe adjusted the personalities Toriyama had given each character, like how the party should not have a quote-unquote reliable and calm leader type at the beginning of the story, in order to more accurately show the confusion and unease of the fate that is bestowed onto them. One of the storytelling challenges based on Toriyama's belief was the despair of the characters and the many points at which they are seemingly cornered. Other plot elements came into question about how they should be handled, and Watanabe did the rest when writing the whole scenario. For the first time ever in a mainline numbered entry in the franchise, Motomu Toriyama wanted to make the lead protagonist be that of a female, since almost all other games had male characters in the leading role, and with Final Fantasy VI maintaining the impression that all the characters were equally developed. Plus, he felt that there should be more games that are more focused on women, since it was too easy to center games on just a male character alone. Since almost all other games are centered on a man, it would only make logical sense to base a new installment around a woman. Thus, Toriyama would be the one responsible for conceiving a female character named Lightning, a strong, beautiful, and athletic soldier with a less feminine, but more tomboyish personality. Tetsuya Nomura's only simple challenge was to make Lightning become reminiscent of Final Fantasy VII's Cloud Strife. Some of the other characters underwent changes as well, but Toriyama's biggest goal with Final Fantasy XIII was to try and replicate the success of Final Fantasy VII, seeing as how people still cherish that game to this day. Other people who worked with Yoshinori Kitase and his team would also be involved in Final Fantasy XIII's development. Aside from himself, Motomo Toriyama, Tetsuya Nomura, Daisuke Watanabe, and Kazushige Nojima being a part of the overall project, others such as Isamu Kamikokurio would be the game's art director, Yoshiki Kashitane led Final Fantasy XIII as the lead programmer, and Masashi Hamauzu would be in charge of the game's entire soundtrack. Final Fantasy XIII would also mark the first time where the franchise's longtime composer, Nobuo Uematsu, would not have any hand in the creation of a main series Final Fantasy game's soundtrack. The designers behind Final Fantasy XIII were all divided into multiple areas, with each designer or team focusing only on a specific task such as developing a specific in-game area or modeling characters. Every physical area of the game was developed separately, and after an initial design was approved, teams were assigned to each specific location and filled in details without reusing assets from other areas, a way to keep all locations fresh from one another. Unlike the previous Final Fantasy games, which were more inspired by Asian locations and culture, the art team wanted Final Fantasy XIII to be reminiscent to that of the United States, with two worlds being connected to each other, as the bigger one would be based on landscape photographs, while the smaller one would be the melting pot of different ethnicities. Since Final Fantasy X took a look at historic culture, Yoshinori Kitase's team decided to head back to the science fiction vibe they had done with Final Fantasy VII, since this new game was intended to replicate its success. At E3 2006, a concept trailer was revealed which showcased lightning on a train and fighting enemies in real time, while the active time battle gauge was there to maintain the strategic nature of command-based battles, as the battles themselves were to be very similar to what was seen in the film, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. The battles were supposed to present themselves in a more cinematic nature, such as different camera angles and shifts to make the fights more dynamic, and lightning having a gravity-controlling ability that influenced the gameplay. In the playable demo at the event, the battle transitions were nearly seamless, as the exploration and battlefields were very similar in appearance. However, what was shown during E3 2006 would not represent the final build of the game. Not only would Final Fantasy XIII be revealed for the first time at the event, but two other projects in relation to it were also revealed under concept trailers. These two games would be under the names Final Fantasy Vs. 13 and Final Fantasy Agito 13, and they too represented the Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy project, as all three games are interconnected to one another, but their stories are completely independent and from different worlds. Each of these games would have their own teams working on the project, as they were all meant to utilize the same Crystal Tools engine so that it could represent the projects that this new mythology of the crystals was going for. With their inclusion into the compilation, Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy had a development budget of over $100 million, twice as much seen for the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. However, with multiple teams working on their own games, it would be one of the several factors that caused problems for not only their development, but Final Fantasy XIII's included. Final Fantasy XIII's overall development was riddled with miscommunication between different sections of the development team and ones for the other two projects. The game would have the largest development staff for the project than any other game in the series at the time, with some in conjunction with the team behind Final Fantasy Vs. 13. This staff had well over 200 people working on it, with 180 artists, 30 programmers, and 36 game designers, but all of their ideas led to the lack of a unified vision. Although the trailer at E3 2006 was revealed as a concept and not anything in a playable form at the time, it led to the pressure within the team on what the battle system should be like. What further complicated the development was that the team was also working on the Crystal Tools engine, as they made the mistake of trying to accommodate every single project in progress, and a considerable amount of time was spent prioritizing all the different requests, which the team was not able to finally determine the full specification requirements. It created a standstill between the engine and game development teams, where if the engine specs were not finalized, neither could the game's development. For being a large-scale project, Square Enix wanted to keep the details of the game secret, but this led to international player testing being too late, which further led to scheduling constraints, as the team wanted to ensure the game would appeal to Western audiences. The development team was well aware of criticism toward Japanese RPGs coming from North America and Europe when it came to game linearity and command-based battles, so the development team experimented with Western development methods, and international focus groups were set up for certain titles including Final Fantasy XIII. However, at that time, the development team was already far along in development, and it was too late to implement most of the feedback. Despite this outcome, The team was able to gain some insight into what players wanted globally, but also led to conflicts because the development team didn't receive clear instructions on whether to force certain changes into an already tight schedule. Many of these problematic development cycles would be why no announcement was made on its progress in 2007 because of these things. To make matters even worse, many people who worked on the project either started to drop out or leave Square Enix to become freelance or to start up their own studios because of these problems. A few of these who would depart from Square Enix would be Toshiro Tsuchida, who was the battle planning director, Takashi Okuma as the background technical director. Final Fantasy XIII's composer Masashi Hamauzu became freelance and continued to contribute to the game's development, along with Nao Ikeda, who was the sub-character designer. At E3 2008, Square Enix made the shocking announcement that Final Fantasy XIII would no longer be a PlayStation 3 exclusive title, as it was also bound for the Xbox 360 by Microsoft, far late in the game's development. This move was mostly made due to the Crystal Tools engine being utilized as a multi-platform program where their games can release on different platforms. While the move made Xbox 360 owners happy that Japanese support was making it onto the system, and with them trying to make more money based on this move, there were others who felt that Square Enix's decision was a betrayal, because the Xbox consoles were mostly targeted for the Western gamer in mind, and that Japanese RPGs were not profitable on the platform, whereas the Nintendo and PlayStation consoles were strongly supportive of the genre. Despite what others may presume, the development of the Xbox 360 version was only an announcement, and not in full production, as it wouldn't begin until after Final Fantasy XIII was released on the PlayStation 3 in Japan, making it still exclusive to the platform for the time being, as the Xbox 360 was not that successful of a platform amongst the Japanese public. Due to the technical limitations such as the size of the game and other things, the Xbox 360 version would have to sacrifice a lower resolution to be playable and spread its game across 3 discs, since the platform continued to use DVDs, where the PlayStation 3 used a single Blu-ray disc, because of it holding 5 times more capacity and giving it more capabilities such as a larger resolution. A playable demo of the game was included in the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Complete, and it helped the team recognize a shared vision for what the game should look and feel like so that the problematic development would not continue, according to Toriyama. Since it helped the team prioritize the work that still needed to be done, it also increased the development speed for the remainder of the project. The main goal for Final Fantasy XIII, according to Motomu Toriyama, was intended to appeal to both Western and Japanese audiences, as the project had focus groups from both regions. The English localization began while development was still in progress to lessen the delay between the Japanese and worldwide releases, and a demo for both the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 versions was showcased at E3 2009 with the voiceovers for the Western release. Final Fantasy XIII would be heavily marketed in Japan around the time when it would release, and a various amount of merchandise was produced to promote the game, such as a limited edition PlayStation 3 with a pink color print of lightning on the surface of the console, as well as a beverage called Final Fantasy XIII Elixir, being distributed by the Japanese alcoholic beverage distributor Suntory. The West had some promotion, but not on a grand scale like Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X. An exclusive Xbox 360 bundle of the game would release in the West, including the silver strip of the hard drive emblazoned with the Final Fantasy XIII logo on it, and PAL Territories received a limited collector's edition for both platforms that included an original sound selection best of soundtrack CD, 3 art prints of the Eidolons in the game, a brand of the L'Cie decal, and the world of Final Fantasy XIII, a hardback book that featured character artwork, CG-rendered artwork, and environments from across the game's production. In Japan, Square Enix would also publish 3 Ultimania books like they have for most of their other Final Fantasy games they put out. After going through so many problems and overcoming them in quite a long schedule, Final Fantasy XIII would finally release on the PlayStation 3 in Japan on December 17, 2009, and on that, in the Xbox 360 for all other territories on March 9, 2010. Final Fantasy XIII is set in the world of Grand Pulse, where the wildlife cultivates the land and has little to do with human affairs. An artificial hollow world above Grand Pulse is the world of Cocoon, where humans live in it, while it's being ruled by a theocratic government known as the Sanctum. The worlds of Grand Pulse and Cocoon are controlled by supernatural beings with the power to govern all life, called the fal'Cie. The Cocoon fal'Cie are responsible for keeping Cocoon floating in the sky, and they work on providing light and water for those who live inside the planet. The fal'Cie and Grand Pulse work to make their planets drive with its own forms of light, and show no regard to those on Cocoon. Each fal'Cie handles a specific task, and they are given the ability of marking humans who live on either planet as their servants. These people who are their servants are labeled as slaves known as l'Cie, and they are branded with a mark, representing either Pulse or the Sanctum within Cocoon along with a focus, a task they must complete. If the l'Cie successfully complete their task in time, they are transformed into Crystal and gain eternal life, according to legend. However, if they are to fail their focus, then they are transformed into mindless monsters called Seath. The l'Cie are not explicitly told what their focus is, but are given visions that they must interpret so that they can figure out what they must do. Several hundred years before the present events, a battle known as the War of Transgression took place between the two worlds. During the battle, the l'Cie from Grand Pulse attacked and ripped a large hole in Cocoon, and they eventually turned into Crystal after completing their focus. The hole in Cocoon was patched with material lifted from Grand Pulse, and Cocoon's citizens begun living in fear, in thinking that another invasion will take place. This fear is used by the Sanctum to remain in power over everyone. The Sanctum oversees two military branches, the Guardian Corps, who is responsible for keeping Cocoon in order, and the Public Security and Intelligence Command, or SICOM for short, the special forces in charge of dealing with any threat related to Grand Pulse. The fal'Cie have given the humans advanced technology, including flying airships and mechanical creatures, and a form of magic also exists. The magic is normally only accessible to the l'Cie, fal'Cie, and various monsters in both worlds, though distilled chemical forms can be used by normal humans through the use of mana drives. Final Fantasy XIII has 6 playable characters, along with a group of side characters and antagonists to fill in the story. The game is led by its female protagonist named Lightning, a former member of the Guardian Corps within the Sanctum, Snowvilliers, the leader of a paramilitary group known as Nora, Erbadia Vanille, the game's narrator, and an exile who is later revealed to be a l'Cie from Grand Pulse, Saz Katzroy, a civilian pilot who is a widow, Hope Estime, a young boy who is struggling within the relationship he shares with his parents, and Erba Yunfang, a l'Cie from Grand Pulse, who is working with the Sanctum's cavalry branch. In the area of side characters are only 3, with one being Sarah Farron, Lightning's younger sister and Snow's fiancée, Dodge Katzroy, Saz's son who he is trying to save for being a l'Cie of the Sanctum with his own focus, and Cid Raines, Final Fantasy XIII's rendition of the character Cid, who is the leader of the Sanctum's cavalry branch, who wants to free himself from his own focus, as he too is a l'Cie, but of that from the Sanctum. The Sanctum is the group of evil within the plot, as it is led by its ruler, and the game's main antagonist named Galanth Daisley, who turns out to be a Sanctum fal'Cie called Bartandalis. The 2 other important figures within the Sanctum are Jill Nabat, the commander of SICOM with a cruel and heartless personality, and her right-hand man, who is the director of SICOM's elite division named Yog Rosh. Those of the paramilitary known as Nora consist of Snow's most trusted friends, Gadot, Labro, Yuge, and Maki. Continuing with the tradition set in Final Fantasy X and XII, Final Fantasy XIII has a huge voiceover cast, with many newer voices joining in for the first time, while using those of more well-known ranks to make up some of the reactionary crowds with little importance. Lightning is voiced by Ali Hillis.
My angle. I'm after the fal'Cie.
Snow is voiced by Troy Baker.
No one survives a fall from that height, not without a miracle. Sarah saved us!
Vanille is voiced by Georgia Van Keulenberg.
Well, since we're here, let's look around.
Saz is voiced by Rena Wilson.
What are you doing trying to stop the purge? Why don't you tell me that?
Hope is voiced by Vincent Martella.
My mother was killed because of him.
Fang is voiced by Rachel Robinson.
If I were you, I'd worry about myself.
Sarah is voiced by Laura Bailey.
She'll be so mad, knowing I hid it from her.
And Galanth Daisley is voiced by Stuart Scott Bullock.
What else does one do with tools?
Final Fantasy XIII's characters continue to be just as large and diverse like the other games, and the voice cast is just as prolific as all the other entries in the franchise. The story is told through 2 major arcs, with one taking place 13 days before the actual events, while the present events are what covers the other. In Cocoon, the citizens of the town of Bodum are being evicted, or purged from Cocoon, after they come into contact with something that has arrived from Grand Pulse, which turns out to be a fal'Cie. Lightning's sister Sarah had found the fal'Cie from Grand Pulse and is changed into a l'Cie by the creature. Lightning works alongside Sass to derail a Purge train bound for Grand Pulse in an attempt to save Sarah, while Snow leads his resistance group, Nora, to rescue the Purge exiles, with several of them being killed in the conflict. Heading to the fal'Cie known as Anima to save Sarah, Snow is joined by two of the exiles named Hope and Vanille. The two parties eventually meet up to witness the fal'Cie, and they find Sarah just as she turns into Crystal. Anima brands the group as Pulse l'Cie, and they are cast out into a different part of Cocoon. During this transformation, the newly crested l'Cie all have the same vision, a monster called Ragnarok. As the party is arguing over the ambitious nature of their dreamed focus, they find Sarah in her crystallized form, with Snow remaining by her side while the others depart. Snow meets up with two members of the cavalry within the Sanctum and is captured and detained aboard the airship known as the Lindblom. Meanwhile, the others flee from PSICOM operatives only to get separated by an airstrike. Lightning and Hope travel to Palampulum, while Saz and Vanille travel to Nautilus. In Lightning's scenario, she unintentionally supports Hope in his goal of killing Snow because of him failing to save his mother named Nora Estime. During Vanille's scenario, Saz discusses how his son Dodge was turned into a l'Cie by the Sanctum fal'Cie and was taken by PSICOM to discover his focus. As Light and Hope reach Palampulum, she tries to dissuade the boy from going through his scheme of revenge and meets up with both Snow and Fang. Fang reveals to Lightning that she and Vanille are a l'Cie from Grand Pulse, who were turned into Crystal, and they were turned back into humans during the 13-day flashback, sparking the Purge. Hope attempts to assassinate Snow, but ends up being rescued by him during an airstrike, thus prompting Hope to not go through with his revenge. After some reconciliation with each other at the home of Hope's father named Bartholomew Estime, whom Hope also reconciled with, the group travels with the head of the Sanctum cavalry named Sid Raines, as he assists them in escaping the city overrun by PSICOM operatives. As Vanille and Saz are in Nautilus, they are ambushed by PSICOM and their commander, Jill Nabat. The cruel commander reveals to Saz that Vanille is a l'Cie from Grand Pulse, and indirectly the reason why Dosh turned into a l'Cie to begin with. As Saz has a near attempt of suicide for the truth that was revealed, both him and Vanille are captured and taken prisoner on the airship called the Palamecia. On the Sanctum's prime airship, all of the protagonists reunite to confront Gallanth Daisley, the Sanctum's Primarch, who is under the disguise of the Sanctum fal'Cie ruler called Bartandalus. Daisley reveals that the group's focus is to transform into the beast Ragnarok and to slay the sleeping fal'Cie keeping Cocoon afloat above Grand Pulse, Orphan. Slaying Orphan will result in Cocoon's destruction, which leads to the discontent of those who live within that world, except for Vanille and Fang. The party manages to escape and meet up with Sid, who explains that the fal'Cie believe that Cocoon's destruction will summon the Maker, the creator of all worlds, and they cannot harm Orphan themselves, resorting to l'Cie to get their job done. Vanille and Fang reveal to everyone that they were involved in the War of Transgression, where their focus was the same as the others now. With no other choice, the party flies away from Cocoon and heads straight into Grand Pulse to learn how they can remove their l'Cie marks. The town of Erba is deserted with no living people left on the surface. For being unsuccessful in removing the brands, the party is once again confronted by Bartandalus. Bartandalus reveals a new fact, that Sid Raines has now been made the new Primarch to create chaos in Cocoon, to force the cavalry to attack him and Orphan in a coup d'etat. The party faces off against Bartandalus again, and rushes back to their home world to try and stop this oncoming battle. As the party travels to Orphan's lair, they discover that the cavalry has been turned into Seath. Bartandalus appears once more, and a fight between him and the party commences once again. Bartandalus is defeated yet again, but is saved by Orphan, who wakes up and merges with him to keep the fal'Cie still alive. This act compels Fang to finish her focus, while the others are supposedly turned into Seath, but is saved from transforming into Ragnarok as the party reappear in human form. They put up one final stand against Orphan, and they escape Cocoon after winning the battle. However, Cocoon is falling towards Grand Pulse, and everyone except for Vanille and Fang are turned into Crystal for completing their focus. Erba's natives remain on Cocoon and transform into Ragnarok to prevent the collision between the two worlds, and succeed while turning into Crystal themselves. The rest of the party awaken from their crystallization stasis on Grand Pulse, as well as knowing that their l'Cie brands are gone. Lightning, Hope, Snow and Saz reunite with Sarah and Dodge as they, along with everyone who survived in Cocoon, begin to celebrate the dawn of a new era, while living on Grand Pulse. In terms of its gameplay, Final Fantasy XIII retreads much similar ground to that of Final Fantasy X, but with its own additions and revisions to the overall formula, while omissions came into play. Final Fantasy XIII resorts to an episodic structure between different areas and scenarios within the plot, as the narrative isn't all under one setting like the other games are. Players can take control of Lightning and her allies during certain parts of the story, but not all of them would be immediately accessible within the first 10 chapters of the story taking place on Cocoon. On Chapter 11, Grand Pulse resorts to being playable, and many feelings of the open-world environment came into play, with side-questing through mission-based objectives, many areas that can be explored in a non-linear environment, and riding on chocobos. Throughout most of the game, every area within Cocoon would force the game to resort into a high linear format in terms of exploration, and it would be up to the player to make it to the end of that chapter in order to move on to the next one. Along the linear path, players can locate treasure chests in the form of round floating spheres that contain items, weapons, junk, gil, and other collectibles. Or they could come into contact with enemies, which completely removes the encounters happening at complete random. The battle system, called Command Synergy Battle, is more tactical to make the battles less practical and selective, as strategy is key to victory. Fighting enemies and bosses still retain the tradition of going through an active time battle system like those seen in the past games, but Final Fantasy XIII has a fast-paced flow when it comes to its newest mechanic, paradigm shifts. Paradigm shifts act as a means for characters to change their roles in battle, to switch up their tactics and use them to give them stronger advantages in battle. Each character can be one of 6 different battle types: Commando, Ravager, Sentinel, Saboteur, Synergist, and Medic. Commandos can build attack chains more easily with enhanced strength. Ravagers can charge enemy chain gauges with concentrated attacks like Black Magic. Sentinels can shield allies from enemy attacks. Saboteurs can enfeeble enemies with debuffs while the party charges their chain gauges. Synergists can support allies with an array of magical enhancements and status buffs. And Medics can focus on restoring hit points and removing status ailments on allies. Using these different tactics can help ensure a more faster and strategic victory than remaining static with the player's desired commands. However, using those means to win a battle at a much quicker rate will not be the way to go and win most fights, as trying to get the enemies unbalanced to reduce their defenses is key. Each enemy with their own chain gauge is specific, and performing the right combos to increase the percentage of attack damage will put that enemy in an unbalanced state called stagger mode to do even more damage onto them. Staggered enemies can also be launched in the air, where characters can perform air attacks and juggles, making the element of staggering essential to winning almost every battle. All the attacks can be selected manually based on a character's ATB gauge, but the magic points that have been a part of the series all the way through have been completely omitted in Final Fantasy XIII. During the game, the protagonist can come into contact with their own Eidolons to summon them and fight in their favor. Commanding an Eidolon is the same as giving commands to the characters, and using them for a ride to unleash all new capabilities in battle resorts to another new mechanic called Gestalt Mode. Gestalt Mode will see an Eidolon transform into a mechanical vehicle of some sort to do all new attacks, and offer a very powerful limit break that will end the summoning. The duration of this mode is determined by the number of attack chains that the summoner builds with their Eidolon. Lightning's Eidolon is Odin, who can transform into Sleipnir when in Gestalt Mode. Snow's is a pair of twins who are each one half of Shiva, who can transform into a motorcycle. Hope's is Alexander, who can become a humanoid figure and allow Hope to ride on it in Gestalt Mode, and Fang's is Bahamut, who can become a flying vehicle to do more air-based attacks. Saz and Vanille's Eidolons are ones that make their debut for the first time, with Saz's being Brynhildr, who is a fire elemental knight who can transform into a sports car, and Vanille's is Hecaton Chair, who is an earth elemental creature that can transform into Magitech armor. Obtaining them in the story will have each character needing to do significant damage to the Eidolons, and then they are given the option to use the Gestalt mode to make that Eidolon become theirs. Battle victories will showcase a player's progress through a 5-star ranking system, along with items won and the obtainment of this game's experience points, called Christogen points. When on the menu screen, everything from item and equipment management still remain intact, but newer features are also in place. The Paradigm menu screen can allow players to have their selected characters undergo different battle stances under the 6 archetypes to give many different battle formations as a result. The equipment menu is utilized for every character to have their own weapons and accessories equipped, with more accessory slots that can be unlocked to ensure stronger stats, elemental attributes, and other buffs like more hit points. The items allow players to use some for healing purposes, while a few others that are considered junk. The formation will allow players to select which party member they want to see in battle, and who they want to have as the one being controlled during field navigation. Finally, the Crystarium menu is the way for characters to upgrade their stats, learn newer abilities, and to receive other bonuses like extra accessory slots. The Crystarium system plays very similarly to Final Fantasy X's Sphere Grid system, but growth is far more linear as each character's Crystarium grid does not connect to each other. That way, each character feels unique to their growth without having the same board to learn everything they can. Each Crystarium grid for every character revolves around their battle archetypes when in paradigm shifts. Learning all the abilities, status upgrades, and other bonuses are determined with how many Crystogen points each character can use before that specific function will become available to them. Not all the abilities are present at the beginning, but they are all gained right before players reach Grand Pulse, so that every character can learn each Crystarium grid to be stronger in that battle archetype. In order for characters to move up further in the Crystarium grids, they must defeat the boss of a specific chapter to gain that privilege to grind them even further. While characters go through the fields like normal, they can come across many save stations where they can save their game, go through the many shops available to buy items, weapons, accessories, and junk, and upgrade their equipment. The mini shops can be obtained from treasure spheres, defeating bosses, and completing missions to make them available, but Gil becomes extremely rare to obtain since battles don't distribute them in that sense this time around. Another thing that carries over from Final Fantasy X is the fact that each weapon and accessory can be upgraded to make them stronger in their effects, and to possibly be upgraded into newer ones. The junk that players carry can be transformed into experience points for the weapons and accessories, as they can be upgraded with stronger stats and much more pro-efficient effects, and upgrading them to a high level can help them evolve into newer ones. Ultimate weapons can be evolved from the weakest of any weapon, but this would mean that grinding for Gil and junk items can result in extraneous long playtimes. Last but not least, missions that take place on Grand Pulse are a means of side questing, and defeating the suggested target can reward players with items, Gil, and more missions they can undertake until they can take on some of the toughest enemies yet. Of course, omissions come into play, as players will notice that there are no towns or non-playable characters to interact with, two staples that have been very prevalent to role-playing games in general since the fields are full of monsters, treasure spheres, and save points with shops, and nothing else. The localization for Final Fantasy XIII went through a very interesting phase as much as the problematic development of the game that occurred. The true difference would be that the localization had no infrastructure to where it and the game's development could be simultaneously supported by each other. There were no content freeze deadlines to ensure the translators were translating with the final context, and cutscenes were still changing even after the English voice recording was finished. Because of this, the entirety of the voice script for Final Fantasy XIII went through re-recording about 4 or 5 times throughout the localization phase. The game's translators would have to translate blindly from text, and then see an early render to notice it would not work. When placeholder audio would show up, the translators would realize their lines would not match the timing or the emotion that would be on the characters' faces. As the translators had scripts from the writers, videos of events, transcripts of the actual Japanese voice data, and the latest game build, all 4 of these would be different, with none of them being finalized. Tom Slattery, who handled the English localization, along with Teruaki Sugawara, the sound engineer who also subsequently left Square Enix, were both serving as representatives from their respective departments at the monthly meetings between sound and localization, and both found out that if that was going to be the way localization was handled on subsequent projects, there needed to be a way of keeping all information synchronized without placing unnecessary burden on the development team, the sound team, or the localization team. Because of the game already far in development and within localization, that feat could not be fully utilized until much later in other projects. Jack Fletcher did the voice directing like he did for Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy X-2, Final Fantasy XII, and Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions. Around 20 auditions were held for the important characters, and Square Enix would let Fletcher cast the rest on his own by giving him character descriptions on how they wanted the characters to sound. For lead and cameo characters, the producers would want to hear at least 5 to 8 different voice samples per character to choose from. The voice directing team would also pick portions from the game script to send to agencies and get auditions back from them. Square Enix also mentioned that they did not want to reuse the same voice actors too much, so anyone who has played a lead role before is unlikely to get another Final Fantasy lead part soon. For example, if Ash's voice actor from Final Fantasy XII, Kari Walgren, were to submit a good audition, Square Enix would not cast her to play the role of Lightning. There was also the idea in place for 2 characters to have Australian accents based on the localization team's ideas, and they requested the voice directing team to look for Australian or New Zealand sounding voices. The rationale was that the team wanted Fang and Vanille to sound like they were from another world, but more in a sense of having a different melody to their voices, rather than a thick accent. That would explain why both Fang and Vanille came from Grand Pulse, whereas everyone else came from Cocoon and sound American in their voices. Final Fantasy XIII faced a very divided audience upon its release, with reviews for the game remaining generally positive overall. Many critics were blown away by the game achieving many technical milestones in game development that were hardly ever made for a high-definition game of any kind. However, some areas such as the story ended up receiving a mixed reception, while many other areas such as the equipment grinding, the linear progression of the game, and certain technical aspects were largely criticized. In terms of the groundbreaking achievements made, the CGI cutscenes, and the almost seamless transition of visual quality between cutscenes and real-time gameplay were positively viewed for that fact. The battle system has been liked for the increased speed and the depth of the customization when it came to the paradigm shift system. Despite the shortcomings of the storyline, the characters and voice acting were all received well, with reviewers stating that characters worked well together and their interactions throughout the game made up for everything else. However, a vast majority of the characters became very unlikable by fans and the general public, as they found that Saz Catchroy ended up being the only exception due to his motive in wanting to save his son. The music done by Masashi Hamauzu was appreciated by many, but were let down that the game's original theme being replaced by the song My Hands by Leona Lewis was very unfortunate. Final Fantasy XIII would go on to sell nearly 7.5 million copies worldwide, making it a commercial success, and currently the 4th best-selling game in the overall franchise, surpassing Final Fantasy X's overall sales. When it came to longtime fans of Final Fantasy, they were so discontent with the game's delivery, as they thought Final Fantasy XIII was a complete betrayal of how role-playing games were supposed to be, and the omission of towns along with the interaction of non-playable characters were a result of that cause. The game's excessive use of grinding when it came to the Crystarium system and the equipment made it more difficult for players to know whether if they were still weak or getting stronger than where they originally were in the process. However, when it came to fans of Final Fantasy VII, they felt that the game came off being a pale imitation as it did not successfully recapture the spirit of making Final Fantasy XIII become great and memorable as its predecessor. It either tried too little or too hard to be like Final Fantasy VII, and thus came off more as a mediocre experience. Perhaps it was due to this perception that led many people to wonder whether or not the game would manage to build an audience as a result. Motomo Toriyama stated that Final Fantasy XIII would need to sell at least 5.5 million copies to make the game become profitable. While that feat would have been just fine on the PlayStation 3, since it sold almost that goal amount at about 5.3 million copies, the Xbox 360 version would be about 2.5 times under that amount, since it sold nearly 2.2 million copies after the game's release. Due to this fact of how the Xbox 360 was more catered to Western gamers in mind, its current sales left some to speculate that the Xbox 360 version of Final Fantasy XIII was more perceived as a commercial failure. Despite everything on what many people may believe, Final Fantasy XIII made nearly 40% over its production costs it broke even on, back in revenue. Even though Square Enix declared that Final Fantasy XIII would be exclusive on the PlayStation 3 in Japan, they went back on their declaration by releasing the game on the Xbox 360 in their home country that included a new easy mode feature that balanced some of the problems the original version had in terms of difficulty. A re-release of that version of the game was made available on the PC through Steam for a worldwide audience in October 2014, while an iOS and Android port of the game would release in April 2015 as an exclusive release in Japan. While no sales numbers have been disclosed on the mobile versions of the game, the Steam version has managed to sell over 600,000 copies. The review scores for Final Fantasy XIII were much lower than compared to previous outings, and it left many to wonder if the game was the start of the series entering into a period of decline, since 2006 was the start of Japanese role-playing games entering into that dark period in gaming history, with Final Fantasy XII being somewhat responsible for that circumstance. In response to the overall criticism that Final Fantasy XIII was receiving, Motomo Toriyama, Yoshinori Kitase, and the then current president of Square Enix at the time, Yoichi Wada, responded to the matter as they gave their reasons for the game's shortcomings. The director Motomo Toriyama felt that the game's polarizing reception for a main Final Fantasy series installment came from reviewers who approached the game from a Western point of view. It was during this time when Western RPGs started to become more appreciated on the home console and PC fronts after games like The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, Mass Effect 1 and 2, Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, and Dragon Age Origins released to critical acclaim and commercial success because of their unique and inspired takes on the RPG genre, and what Final Fantasy XIII did was a subpar effort, since role-playing games have been mostly remembered for having inspirational stories, creative worlds, memorable characters, compelling soundtracks, and inventive gameplay mechanics to hold out on their own. Toriyama also stated that these reviewers were used to games in which the player was given an open world to explore, and that this expectation contrasted with the vision the team set out to create. Developing new games for newer generations of hardware can be very difficult to tell a compelling story when the player is given that much freedom. While he wouldn't be that too far from the truth, since Final Fantasy games have been greatly remembered for their stories, Western RPGs have managed to achieve those fronts by pushing past what was seen in the overall genre than just maintaining an outdated template that's been done since the golden age of Japanese RPGs in the 90s. Yoshinori Kitase also gave his 2 cents, as he stated that the team behind Final Fantasy XIII did not intend to work within the RPG template, but wanted to create a new game, even a new genre. Since Kitase has gone on and declared that first-person shooters are his favorite genre of video games outside of what he works on, he said that Final Fantasy XIII played more like an FPS than an RPG to various degrees. This notion said by Kitase came to the fact that Square Enix was trying to capitalize on the success of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare by Activision, since the game done extremely well in the critical and commercial status quo, and trying to take more inspiration from Western games instead of being true to themselves was what led many to believe that Final Fantasy XIII was a complete betrayal to the overall series and the genre. Toriyama and Kitase said in late July 2011 that the biggest complaints about the game were that it was too linear and that there was not enough interaction between the player and the world, which they described as a lack of towns and minigames compared to previous entries in the series. Plus, they noted the amount of time it took to access all the gameplay elements as another common criticism, saying that people interpreted the game as a lengthy tutorial. Now, this feature is not that uncommon for role-playing games in the modern era, as games like Mass Effect, Dragon Age Origins, Fallout 4, and The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim are large games where their learning curves are extremely steep, as gameplay elements within those games are not all fully learned until at least halfway through. Final Fantasy XIII, on the other hand, did not have a learning curve that was too steep, as the experience was more elongated and stretched out to tell more story than offer deep gameplay from what many criticized the game for. Finally, Yoichi Wada also gave his thoughts about the game's generally positive reception when he was interviewed by Gamasutra. He would go on the record and state that some value the game highly and some are not very happy with it. While it is true that there are a few who still like the game for what it is, many others felt that the quality was sacrificed because of the gameplay not being that intuitive, creative, or fun to gauge enough interest. Lastly, Wada stated whether Final Fantasy should become a new type of game or not, as customers have different opinions for the developer to determine which way the series should go in the future. Yoichi Wada's quotes from there were enough for fans of Final Fantasy to believe that Final Fantasy XIII's development was interfered by management so much, with him endorsing the game in this new direction, that they were out of touch with what fans have been expecting for Square Enix's first high-definition iteration in the series. Final Fantasy XIII's outcome would be a very unfortunate one for most people, and it was enough to wonder if the franchise would become even more stale with future entries that were to come. In the end, Motomu Toriyama took the criticisms and fan feedback at heart, as it would help him shape up newer games under his direction, and he knew that Final Fantasy XIII should deserve much better. The Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy multimedia project did not just restrict itself to Final Fantasy XIII alone, as other games were fully and currently being conceived by different teams within Square Enix. Final Fantasy Agito XIII was the next game to release in 2011, but it went under a name change to potentially start this new game as a new brand within the franchise. What was known as Final Fantasy Agito XIII would be renamed to Final Fantasy Type 0, and it played more in the vein of a real-time action RPG than a turn-based one. The premise of the game takes place in the fictional world of Orient, where 4 nations known as Crystal States hold a power of the crystal that houses every element along with them named after the 4 symbols of the Chinese constellations. The water crystal would be protected under the Lorican Alliance that is home to Genbu, the Black Tortoise. The wind crystal would be protected by the Kingdom of Concordia that is home to Seiryu, the Azure Dragon. The Earth Crystal would be protected under the Milites Empire that is home to Byakko, the White Tiger, and the game's primary antagonistic force. And the Fire Crystal would be protected by the Dominion of Rubrum that is home to Suzaku, the Vermilion Bird, and the home of the protagonists. Those crystals within each state can grant certain individuals to become a lessee along with the focus they must fulfill. Each nation governs a military academy who must fight for them when conflict arises, and the Dominion of Rubrum would be home to a special unit of super soldiers under the name Class Zero. Class Zero is a group of 14 individuals where 12 of them are fully adopted, tutored, and trained by a woman who happens to be one of the Fal'Cie who oversees the activities and warfare happening in Orience. The 12 children of the divine servant Pulse are burdened with the mission to protect their land and the world of Orience from the Milites Empire's supreme conquest over everything, and they consist of the Class Zero cadets Ace, Deuce, Trey, Cater, Sync, Sice, 7, 8, 9, Jack, Queen, and King. The 12 adopted children within Class Zero are all named after a number from a deck of cards, whereas Makina Kunagiri and Rim Tokimiya are the only ones with original names. Gameplay is divided between the playable locations and the world map, as battles are done in real-time hack-and-slash beat-em-up action or in real-time strategy sequences against the enemy forces. Each character, aside from 2 who are original names, represents one of the trumps within playing cards, and they have their own unique weapons. Their abilities all differ, and players can switch between whoever they wish to play as during the whole game. Many come to believe that the game is more reminiscent to that of Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII because of combat being more freestyle and less restrictive towards an active time battle system which is completely absent. Despite it being a spiritual successor to that game alone, the expansive amount of characters that are playable made this game more of a spiritual successor to that of before Crisis Final Fantasy VII, as that feature of numerous characters represents the Turks in that universe. Not to mention, most of the staff from both of those games, including Hajime Tabata as director and Takeharu Ishimoto as the music composer, worked together to make Final Fantasy Type 0, as their elements are very similar to what was seen from both of those games in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. The West would not receive Final Fantasy Type 0 on the PlayStation Portable, as Hajime Tabata cited the PlayStation Portable's flagging sales in the Western market and uncertainty surrounding the upcoming PlayStation Vita for there being no localization announcement. Fortunately, a high-definition remaster that went under the name Final Fantasy Type 0 HD would release to all regions from around the world, and it included special features not seen in its Japanese counterpart, such as full voice acting in English. Some features in the original PSP release, such as the multiplayer elements, were fully removed to optimize the game on consoles, while types of magic and accessories that are exclusive to multiplayer were implemented into the single-player campaign. A very unique feature to Final Fantasy Type 0 HD is the support personnel system, and it allows players to activate AI-controlled support characters in the fields to take place as normal party members. A currency for support personnel is also in place, as earning them in battle can be used to purchase special items that can't be obtained anywhere else. Finally, additional costumes for the characters were made available from the original demos and downloadable content as unlockables, and ones that are unique to the HD version of the game. Upon its release, Final Fantasy Type 0 received a very positive reception on the PlayStation Portable, while Final Fantasy Type 0 HD on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC received a more mixed response from critics. Many of the game's criticisms were largely placed on the removal of the original multiplayer featured in the PSP original, the English voice cast, as they were not that strong in their overall performance, and keeping some of the low-quality textures in place of the environments within the overall gameplay. 2 companion pieces were made on smartphones, with Final Fantasy Agito releasing in Japan in May 2014, and its replacement called Final Fantasy Awakening that released in both the Chinese and Australian markets, with a US release slated for some time in the future, and a PC port to release worldwide at some point. In 2015, a sequel to Final Fantasy Type 0 was shown during a release party for the HD release in Japan, where Hajime Tabata displayed artwork in CG-rendered material for what was proposed under the title, Final Fantasy Type Next. Even though Tabata has expressed passionate interest in wanting to create this game, he departed from Square Enix in October 2018, while no more news about Final Fantasy Type Next was made available since it was first unveiled. The possibility for that project to come to fruition and to be fully conceived is much less likely to happen. After the release of Final Fantasy XIII and it receiving a polarizing reception that made those appreciative or discontent to its overall delivery, it would not be the only time the game would appear before their eyes. Taking to heart with the criticisms and feedback toward Final Fantasy XIII, Motomu Toriyama decided that the next game in the Fabula Nova Crystallis project should be a direct sequel on the game he already worked on. With most of the team who worked on Final Fantasy XIII under Square Enix's first production department that consisted of teams who worked on the Kingdom Hearts series, Dissidia Final Fantasy, and other games within the Fabula Nova Crystallis compilation, the direct sequel that Motomu Toriyama took the helm in directing would officially be named Final Fantasy XIII-2. Hints about a sequel to Final Fantasy XIII were first given when Square Enix stated that they would be willing to create a direct sequel if fans demanded it, and Toriyama obliged to the declaration as demand was actually there, along with the fact that there was enough cut content from Final Fantasy XIII to put into a sequel. Many key personnel from Final Fantasy XIII remained in their roles, with Toriyama as director, Yoshinori Kitase as lead producer, Tetsuya Nomura as the main character designer, Daisuke Watanabe as the scenario writer, and Isamu Kamikokurio as the art director. Toshiro Tsuchida would not return as the battle planning director, as Yoshiki Kashitani would take over that role, while still attributing as the main programmer. Masashi Hamazu would continue to supply the soundtrack for the universe for Final Fantasy XIII, but he would also be joined by Naoshi Mitsuda and Mitsuto Suzuki to work on Final Fantasy XIII-2's music compositions. The troubled development of Final Fantasy XIII that had been caused by the simultaneous creation of the company-wide engine Crystal Tools gave reason for Square Enix to rethink the production process for high-budget games. For Final Fantasy XIII-2, the development team consulted with their recently purchased subsidiary from Europe, Eidos Interactive, to more closely adapt a Western approach to game development. As a consequence towards this decision, monthly schedules and project milestones were introduced to better monitor the staff members' progress. Furthermore, the game was not entirely developed in-house like the original Final Fantasy XIII, as the Japanese studio responsible for the Star Ocean and Valkyrie Profile games, Tri-Ace, was contracted to help out with aspects of the game design, art, and programming. This move was utilized as a way to keep internal staff members lower for the game's development, as they were already working on other games from within such as Kingdom Hearts and the other games in the Fabula Nova Crystallis multimedia franchise. The contributions of external developers were planned and clearly divided beforehand to achieve a more structured team towards this project. Several video concepts and frequent playtests were conducted to help the staff be constantly engaged with trying to maintain the game's overall vision. Even though Final Fantasy XIII had strong sales after its launch in all regions, the front of its extreme linear nature, the lack of interaction of non-playable characters, and lack of minigames and puzzles were things that made many still highly critical of the game. The developers intended to address these complaints in Final Fantasy XIII-2 by adding in a new gameplay mechanic, numerous side quests from non-playable characters including interactions with them, and a new area consisting of a casino. All the environments in Final Fantasy XIII-2 were made to be more explorable instead of going through a predestined path all the way through, and this helped the artists to be given enough freedom to include their own ideas in the game's playable locations so that they can make the game feel more surreal and less artificial. Even though the designers were explicitly addressing the criticisms when developing the game, they saw the changes and additions as making the sequel be more in line with what players had hoped for Final Fantasy XIII to become, rather than backing away from the changes that it brought to the overall series. The structure of the side quests and other things like the overly abundant amount of chocobos and a more open environment made the team state that they drew inspiration from Rockstar Games' own Red Dead Redemption because of the many things gamers could do in an open world experience like that. Not to mention, Final Fantasy XIII-2 would be the first in the series to include multiple endings, something that was not very common in the franchise. The writing for Final Fantasy XIII-2 was another thing that the team wanted to address, as some felt that the convoluted and overarching plot in the original was hard to comprehend for most players. Toriyama originally did not envision the plot as being a direct sequel to Final Fantasy XIII, as he wanted it to take place 900 years in the future, with the human population now living a great life within Grand Pulse. However, trying to create a new story that involved new characters was not that easy for Toriyama to come by, as he grew very accustomed to the world he helped create. Since he did not want to stray away from the characters he helped envision, but still wanting the setting to take place in the future, the story would involve the concept of time traveling. Toriyama also expressed his wish to create a story where Lightning ends up truly happy one day, as he felt that her emotional state was very doubtful at the end of Final Fantasy XIII. Plus, he wanted Lightning's sister, Sarah Farron, to have an even more active role because her crystal stasis in the original game prevented her from having that feature. Daisuke Watanabe thought about how the narrative could be continued in a sequel when working on the scenario for Final Fantasy XIII-2. So a writer by the name of Emi Nagashima, also known by her pen name, Jun Eishima, wrote several novellas for Final Fantasy XIII that would help the team come up with the plot for the sequel after an early consultation in the development. The narrative ended up being divided into smaller pieces of drama that were similar to what was seen to a television series rather than one overarching story piece. Final Fantasy XIII-2 was originally going to be called Final Fantasy XIII Season 2 when the project was first proposed within Square Enix, but decided with the name they finally went with because of how well received that Final Fantasy X-2 was not only in its name, but in its consistency and name recognition. Unlike Final Fantasy X-2 having more cheerful, humorous, and lighthearted tones in its story when comparing it to Final Fantasy X, the staff members wanted the overall tone of Final Fantasy XIII-2 to be serious, as well as much darker and more mysterious than the original game. Sarah Farron was chosen to be Final Fantasy XIII-2's main protagonist, as the original scenario would have her searching for lightning along with a Moogle companion named Mog. When Yoshinori Kitase looked over the script, he found it to be quote-unquote quite girly, almost camp and a bit over the top, that resulted in a tonal shift being too similar to that of Final Fantasy X and X-2 when it came to Riku. To counter this and add more equality in the tone of the story, a new protagonist named Noel Kreis was created. Even though it would have been natural for both Sarah and Snow to travel together in this new game, his appearance was lessened greatly by making Sarah travel more with Noel, as the developers were trying to avoid any allegations of pedophilia that some may have stipulated between the two characters in Final Fantasy XIII. Watanabe also found script writing for the game's two-character party to be difficult because the lack of varied personality provided by an ensemble cast was what made him have a hard time with the dialogue. Because of this, he had to make sure that conversations between Sarah and Noel would not be repetitive or unrealistic. The concepts used in the Fabula Nova Crystallis project, such as Lassie and Fal'Cie, were difficult for the general audience to understand, so the developers avoided using those terms in the sequel, despite them still being used as a backdrop to that universe, whereas they found a time paradox to be a more familiar form of mystery. Final Fantasy XIII-2 would end up using different types of art styles, with Isamu Kamikokurio saying that even with the worlds of Grand Pulse and Cocoon being reduced close to ruin after the events of the original game, he ended up being careful in expressing the serious tone of the story, as it would go for more of a dark atmosphere, rather than having a beautiful but manufactured setting done in Final Fantasy XIII. Going along with this dark atmosphere, and to help shape it up for the sequel, the development team took inspiration from works of surrealism, which have been common in art pieces done by Salvador Dalí and Giorgio de Chirico, and they were used as references to find a balance between photo-like realism and an unrealistic fantasy. Kamikokurio further stated that the character designs are built from the scenario and setting, and the new designs for Lightning and Sarah are reflected within the environments where they begin their journey. Speaking of which, Tetsuya Nomura only provided sketches of the faces on the main characters, as other artists would be in charge of creating their outfits, with Kamikokurio being in charge of Lightning's design, Yusuke Naora being in charge of Sarah and Noel's costumes, as he and Hideo Minaba would work on other characters in the same capacity. Mog would be designed by Toshitaka Matsuda after he received a request for a cute and mascot-like Moogle character. Before and during the development of this game, Final Fantasy XIII-2 received some marketing for all regions from around the world, as it wasn't that grand as the original game from 2009 and 2010. Aside from Toriyama expressing his desire to continue the story after the original game's conclusion, Yoshinori Kitase said that if XIII-2 were to be made, then the team could direct all their attention to the story and refine what was already built. In December 2010, Tetsuya Nomura released a drawing of Lightning, along with the words, "She must not be forgotten." By January 11, 2011, Square Enix registered the domain name FinalFantasy13.2game.com via a proxy company that it had used to register websites for several of their other unannounced games. 1 week later, on January 18, 2011, Square Enix officially announced Final Fantasy XIII-2 during the first production department premiere in Tokyo, and a trailer showed Lightning, outfitted in knight's armor, drawing her weapon towards an unnamed figure who was not named as of yet, but ended up being called Caius Ballad in the final product. Square Enix teamed up with the company named Morinaga, who are popular with their potailong snack, and they featured limited-time Final Fantasy XIII-2 themed packaging to the product. At around the game's release in Japan, a new limited edition 320GB PlayStation 3 Slim featured an image of Lightning on the top matte finish of the console. Also, 2 new books were released, with one being a postcard book with 24 CG illustrations of the characters, including an 8-page character introduction, and a 232-page book titled Final Fantasy XIII-2. Fragments Before, which takes place immediately before the events of the game and contains several stories revolving around primary and secondary characters. The postcard book would be priced at 1,260 yen, with the 232-page book costing around 1,470 yen at release. Since downloadable content was something that the development team wanted to implement into the original Final Fantasy XIII, but didn't have enough time due to scheduling constraints, they made that a priority for the sequel, as they felt it was a welcomed custom towards the mini-games in the era of high-definition gaming which used that feature. Some of those pieces of DLC included 6 fights at the Colosseum, where boss characters from past installments in the franchise, including characters from Final Fantasy XIII, would be fought as optional bosses, and outfits reminiscent of job classes from past games, and certain casual wear would make up for costumes, including weapons and 3 bonus episodic scenarios to flesh out the plot more. North America would officially receive a collector's edition, which included packaging that featured artwork by Yoshitaka Amano, a 4-disc original soundtrack that excludes 2 songs, with there being a secret one that plays as the background to the DLC Colosseum, and a collection of concept artwork containing a variety of never-before-seen illustrations, environments, etc. Europe and Australia would have 3 different editions of Final Fantasy XIII-2 to release, with the limited collector's edition, the Crystal edition that has the 4-disc soundtrack with all the songs available, including a t-shirt from Square Enix products that would not be available from anywhere else, and the Nordic edition, which included mostly additional downloadable content and not any physical memorabilia. Pre-order extras were also included in European retailers much like the ones seen in North America, such as Best Buy, Amazon, and GameStop. The Asian market promoted Final Fantasy XIII-2 very similarly to the Japanese market, but it had its own bonuses not done in any other territory. To promote the game's release in Japan, AKB48 member Yuko Oshima was appointed the leader of a group of 13 official playtesters, and Square Enix would often release videos of her and the other playtesters playing the game. Final Fantasy XIII-2's development was far more shorter than that seen for the original Final Fantasy XIII, and the cycle lasted for nearly 1.5 years due to tighter development schedules and a shared vision where the developers would be successfully in tandem in creating the game. It would finally go on and release in Japan on December 15, 2011, January 31, 2012 for North America, and then a few days later in both Europe and Australia. The story for Final Fantasy XIII-2 follows on after Final Fantasy XIII, but as is typical for the series, it is unrelated to all other previous Final Fantasy games. To recap from the original Final Fantasy XIII, one of the fal'Cie, the race of supernatural gods, transformed a group of 6 people into l'Cie and hoped that they would initiate Ragnarok. The group led by Lightning were intended to cause Cocoon to fall into Grand Pulse, which would kill the humans living in the floating sphere. At the finale of the game, both Vanille and Fang transformed into a crystal pillar to support Cocoon from crashing on Grand Pulse, preventing the catastrophe. At the end of Final Fantasy XIII, everyone is reunited, with Lightning giving her blessing for her little sister, Sarah Farron, to marry Snow Villiers. But the beginning of Final Fantasy XIII-2 shows that the event of the ending has been altered, as Lightning ended up falling down a chasm that sends her 700 years into the future and into an abandoned kingdom ruled by the goddess Etro called Valhalla. Sarah is the only one who remembers the actual events, while everyone else is completely oblivious and thinks that Lightning is gone for good. Final Fantasy XIII-2 begins 3 years after the end of 13, and the inhabitants of Cocoon migrate to Grand Pulse after the planet's fall, and its own government, the Sanctum, existing no more. By migrating toward Grand Pulse, some of the people have learned magical abilities, and this new era would give birth to the Afterfall timeline, with everything starting out in the year 3 AF. Lightning would be in the year 700 AF, as end times for Grand Pulse are near, with a mysterious man trying to unleash a dark force called the Chaos that is being trapped in Etro's throne. Lightning would continue to have a prominent role in the story, but she would only appear as a supporting character, including the lead narrator, and she would not be the main protagonist this time around. That role would be given to her sister, Sarah Farron, a resident to the town of New Bodom, who awaits for Lightning's return, as Snow went on a journey to rescue her. Destiny awaits her as a man named Noel Christ would appear from the distant future upon Lightning's request for her sister to come and find her. Hope Estheim and Snow Villiers would be back with important roles to the story, whereas the other main characters Vanille, Fang, Saz and his son Daj would make cameo appearances. Appearing for the first time would be a dark warrior named Caius Ballad, who seeks to escape from a curse by unleashing the chaos from Etra's throne in Valhalla, and he would be Final Fantasy XIII-2's primary antagonist. Joining him would be a young Cirrus named Padrasu Yule, who possesses the all-seeing eyes of Etro. Finally, a girl named Alyssa Zidel works as an assistant for Hope, as he would be the leader of a new technocratic government called the Academy. Mog would appear in the game as a major supporting character to Sarah, as he would be sent by lightning from 700 AF to 3 AF to act as Sarah's good luck charm. Tasks for localization remained in a similar manner to that of Final Fantasy XIII, and several voice actors from that game would return for their respective roles, such as Ali Hillis as Lightning, Laura Bailey as Sarah, Troy Baker as Snow, and Vincent Martella as Hope. Joining the cast for the first time would be Jason Marsden as Noel Kreis.
In my world, Cocoon doesn't exist. When I was born, the sky was already empty.
Ariel Winter learning from playing the role of Marlene Wallace in Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Complete to voice Mog.
I'm an expert at detecting things no one else can find, Kubo.
Liam O'Brien returning from playing the role of Kane Highwind in Final Fantasy IV DS to voice the main antagonist Caius Ballad.
This eternity, it was never your desire. Is that not so? You...
Amber Hood voicing Padra Sue Ewell.
Thank you.
And Kim My Guest voicing Alyssa Zidell.
That's what we figured. Thought we'd save you the trip.
Final Fantasy XIII-2 begins in the year 3 AF in Grand Pulse's calendar, and the Pulse town of New Bodom that Sarah lives in becomes attacked by monsters. A stranger named Noel Kreis appears out of nowhere to help fight off the monsters, and he claims to everyone that he is a time traveler from 700 AF, as well as the last surviving human from very far into the future. He arrived in Lightning's time of 700 AF, where he claims to have met her and she's been guarding the throne of a weakened Etro. As part of Lightning's transfer to that timeline, she was erased from the fall of Cocoon onwards, which made everyone except Sarah forget her as they believe she is dead, and paradoxes have erupted throughout time, warping the timeline. Sarah joins Noel and Mog on a journey to resolve these paradoxes by removing items and monsters, which are out of their original time, and correct the timeline, she in hopes of finding her sister, and he in hopes of changing the bleak future he comes from. Beginning their first travel to the year 5 AF to resolve a paradox on Cocoon, they meet up and help a woman named Alyssa Zidell, an Academy member and survivor of the Purge which occurred at the beginning of Final Fantasy XIII. Traveling to the ruined city of Padra in 10 AF, there they find Hope, who has since become the leader of the Academy, with Alyssa as his assistant. From there, they also find a recording of prophecies made by one of the Seeresses of Padra, who are believed to have died out centuries prior. One fragmented passage shows lightning in Valhalla. Padra is then shredded by an eclipse, which Noel says that isn't supposed to happen for several centuries. While Sarah, Noel, and Mog arrive in Erba in 200 AF to resolve the paradox causing the eclipse, they encounter Caius Ballad, a man Noel is acquainted with from 700 AF, who opposes their mission, and Ewell, who looks identical to a girl of the same name Noel knew in the future. After resolving the paradox, an alternate timeline is created where the eclipse never happens. The repaired prophecy shows Caius and Valhalla going face to face with lightning, and the pillar supporting Cocoon collapsing. Noel claims that this new prophecy takes place around 400 AF, as it is the time where the human population is completely devastated, and it created a future where Noel ends up as the last surviving human to ever exist. Sarah, Noel, and Mog move on, as Hope and Alyssa work on finding some way to prevent the pillar from collapsing. The protagonists then move on to the year 300 AF in Cocoon, and they both find Snow fighting a giant paradox-fueled monster that is dissolving the crystal pillar. After resolving the paradox, which delays the fall of Cocoon until 500 AF, Snow disappears again as an anomaly from another time. Sarah, Noel, and Mog now make their way to the city of Academia on Grand Pulse in the year 400 AF, where they get attacked by the city's artificial intelligence, which claims that the protagonists were killed in 200 AF. Traveling to the Augusta Tower in the year 200 AF, they discover a paradox whereby a man-made fal'Cie, meant to re-levitate Cocoon, was able to turn on its creators, using the AI that designed it and take over the technocratic government of the Academy. In resolving this paradox, Sarah, Noel, and Mog travel to an alternate timeline of 400 AF in Academia. In the strange new timeline, they find both Hope and Alyssa once more, who had put themselves in stasis. They explain their new plan to mechanically float a new Cocoon to hold humanity, which Sarah and Noel help with before heading into 500 AF Academia. As they nearly arrive in the new year within the technocratic metropolis, they are betrayed by Alyssa, who is revealed to be a living paradox doomed to disappear in the correct timeline, and trapped by Caius in dream worlds. Before being trapped, Sarah meets with the spirit of Ewell, who explains to her that she is a Seeress of Padra, meaning that she is gifted with Etro's own heart that continues to reincarnate her throughout history, while Caius plays the role of her immortal guardian. She then explains that every time the timeline is completely changed to a regular or alternate timeline, the resulting shock automatically kills her. Caius sees her go through this dilemma and is driven mad to the point where he seeks to unleash the chaos trapped in Valhalla to destroy all time. Sarah is revealed to have the same power as Yule, but the reason she keeps alive is because she risks death every time when she changes the future. Resolving to put an end to this madness, Sarah breaks free from her own dream world and frees Noel from his own, in which he is the last living human after his Yule dies and Caius departs for Valhalla. By hurrying to Valhalla, Sarah, Noel, and Mog have a brief meeting with Lightning, and then they fight Caius in Academia during the year 500 AF, as well as Valhalla. Upon his defeat, Caius claims that he has killed Lightning, and then he impales himself through the heart with Noel's blade, killing the weakened Etro. When the traveling party returns to Academia in 500 AF, Vanille and Fang have been rescued from the collapsing pillar, and the new cocoon known as Bunavelza has arisen. Unexpectedly, Sarah dies in front of Noel and Hope from the shock of the future changing, and a black cloud erupts from the sky as the chaos that Etro was guarding breaks free. The last scene shows Lightning once again in crystal stasis while sitting on the throne of Etro's temple, ending Final Fantasy XIII-2 on a cliffhanger. Final Fantasy XIII-2 plays very similarly to its predecessor, but it had its own additions and revisions to answer toward the criticisms and fan feedback it originally received. Instead of everything going forward in a linear path, players can move either Sarah or Noel through a third-person perspective to interact with non-playable characters, objects, and fight enemies when in specific locations in the game. The sequel incorporates a 360-degree camera so that players can look at all of their surroundings, much like the 360-degree camera in its predecessor. When playing the game, Final Fantasy XIII-2 includes both normal and easy modes to have players set their preferred difficulty, and the world in the game is rendered to scale relative to the characters as every area is represented proportionally. This eliminates the use of having caricatures of characters roaming around miniature terrain, as that was common in the earliest years of the franchise. Navigation can be done on foot or by yellow or red chocobos. The only difference is that red chocobos will constantly consume Gisal greens in your inventory since they are wild, while the yellow ones are tame. Since time traveling is a crucial element to the story, it becomes a crucial feature in the gameplay as this new system goes under the name Historia Crux. The overall world is divided into multiple regions in different time periods where some of them can be revisited in different forms during those different times. For example, the region of Erba can be reached in the years 200 AF, 300 AF, and 400 AF, while certain locations such as the Sunlith Waterscape can only be visited in the years 300 AF and 400 AF, while the Augusta Tower can be visited in the years 200 AF and 300 AF. Along with regular timelines, alternate timelines can also be visited, with some of those locations going through a radical change or become accessible that could not be done in the regular timeline. The Historia Crux is what connects the regular and alternate timelines into one system for players to go through at their own free will. The feature of time travel in this game drew inspirations from the 16-bit Japanese RPG on the Super Nintendo, Chrono Trigger, as that element was very prevalent to its overall tale. Final Fantasy XIII-2 also incorporates alternate endings called paradox endings, and the outcome of these endings is decided after completing the game's main storyline. To access new regions and newer timelines, players would have to go through important plot points or by acquiring special items called artifacts to unlock those new paths in their playthrough. When accessing a previously visited region, both Sarah and Noel will appear in the location of their last visit. Special items in the game are referred to as seals, and these seals can allow players to revert regions to their previous statuses to play through them again, and vice versa in unsealing them. Unlike its predecessor, where save portals appear very frequently during the gameplay, Final Fantasy XIII-2 automatically saves the game when players enter the Historia Crux, as well as going through key moments in the game's plot. They can also manually save their game at any time if they desire to do so. Instead of accessing stores via save points like in its predecessor, players can purchase items from a character named Chocolina, who can be found in every location and time period throughout the game. If players wanted to see the bestiary of enemies as well as incidental information in the plot of Final Fantasy XIII-2, an in-game data log like what were both shown in its predecessor is provided to them for just that cause. By talking to non-playable characters, the game sometimes will begin a new gameplay element called the live trigger system, where the player chooses their response from several options as they are generally not repeatable. The game also occasionally features temporal rifts that act as puzzles, which the player must complete to close that rift and continue on with the journey. Completing the puzzles in the temporal rifts and the numerous side quests that non-playable characters can give to players will reward them with the most important key items to the overall game: fragments. When it comes to the overall battle system, it pretty much remains the same with its additions and revisions, much like the general gameplay from the navigation aspect. Final Fantasy XIII-2 continues to use the command synergy battle system much like Final Fantasy XIII, where attacks, abilities, and items can be manually selected or auto-battle to have select commands be done automatically for the player. Each of these actions require a specific number of slots on the ATB bar like what was seen in Final Fantasy XIII, and they continue to refill at a constant rate to set a maximum number of slots. The ATB bar can be increased from 3 bars to 6 bars as players progress through the game. When players are fighting monsters, or if they die in battle, they are given the option to restart a fight during any time if they are not too satisfied with the results they are experiencing in those particular skirmishes. During some of those skirmishes, players end up being put through a series of QuickTime events called cinematic actions that allow them to strike even greater damage onto enemies and end off certain battles. This new feature most likely takes over the feature of Gestalt mode, as Eidolons are not an option in combat for this game. Instead of the last game that showed monsters running around on the map, they randomly appear like in previous games in the series to initiate the fight sequences. Striking down an enemy that randomly appears before a battle is engaged can give the playable party an advantage to an enemy's stagger gauge. However, taking too long to avoid enemies and entering battles after an allotted time is spent will negate any privilege of restarting the battle until either the party vanquishes their enemies or when they sadly get a game over. The length of the battle the players go through will determine their results and bonuses they receive at the end of each engagement. Although players are rewarded with Christogen points after a random battle just like the last game, they can also obtain the in-game currency of Gil, as that wasn't done from its predecessor. Christogen points can also be obtained from the various fragments and paradox endings that players achieve, and their amounts vary depending on the importance of those two features. Another new feature in the combat is that monsters can actually fight alongside Sarah and Noel to act as a third party member in battle. Monsters must be captured from battles before they can be used, and there are around 150 different types to capture throughout the whole game. Captured monsters will act just like the main characters in battle, but they can also perform a feral link attack, which will increase the chances of capturing other monsters. A new type of damage called a wound damage lowers a target member's max hit points during the battle and can only be healed by items, giving further incentive for the player to defeat enemies as fast as possible. One of the main characters can be controlled by the player in battle, while the other and a monster can be controlled through the game's artificial intelligence. Chain gauges make a return, as they can be increased by hits from melee or magic to make enemies and bosses stagger and drop their defenses at a significant rate. The weather or climate type in an area can affect battles in various ways. Next, the Paradigm Shift system returns, which offers similar functionality to that of Final Fantasy XIII, with the 6 different roles that are still present: Commando, Ravager, Saboteur, Synergist, Sentinel, and Medic. Customizing different sets of paradigms outside of conflict is crucial to help out in selecting those different sets when in battle. Monsters only have one role, and they can be switched when different paradigm shifts are changed, and players can select 3 of them they prefer to use in paradigms when in battle. Finally, the Crystarium system makes a return in Final Fantasy XIII-2 in a modified form. This altered system consists of constellation-style representations of the character's weapon and tamed monsters, made up of small and large crystal nodes, which can be accessed from the start of the game. There is 1 Crystarium grade available for each monster in their paradigm role, while Sarah and Noel can grind through multiple paradigm roles just like before. But certain monsters can evolve their Crystarium grids with much stronger items in order to be one step closer in reaching their full potential. Christogen points gained in battle can be used to expand a Crystarium grid by unlocking bonuses to health, magic, strength, or provide the characters with newer abilities in slots for battle accessories. When it comes to monsters, the bonuses are unlocked with items dropped by defeated enemies or from purchasing them at a store that is run by Chocolina. When completing the main quest, the game will allow players to continue where they left off so that they can reset the gates in the Historia Crux at any time, and new content and endings can become available through this feature. While the fan reception for the game ended up being much more appreciative than its predecessor, Final Fantasy XIII-2 retains a similar reception of generally positive reviews from critics alike. From a Japanese perspective, many thought it was a much better improvement over the original Final Fantasy XIII, and the many improvements made up for the shortcomings that were originally seen. The surreal setting done in Final Fantasy XIII-2 was greatly praised for looking more organic and natural rather than being artificial, and the story would be very easy to get into. When it comes to Western critics, the response has been mostly positive like what the Japanese have said, but there were other areas that they were more critical towards. While the graphics were generally praised, some felt that it was a step back from the artificial and colorful atmosphere seen in Final Fantasy XIII. The voice direction and character interactions were just as impressive as the original game, and the voices for the newer characters helped them breathe life into the dialogue. The music done in Final Fantasy XIII 2 ended up being more mixed than positive, as some felt that the composition suffered from a lack of coherent direction, with certain tracks failing to match their scenes, although there are some who still enjoy it for what it is. The gameplay was generally praised as well, with some saying that the improvements only benefited to a more polished experience for what is normally seen in a role-playing game. Their response to the battle system was just as positive as the general gameplay, but some felt that those improvements actually made the combat a bit too easy. Final Fantasy XIII 2 did have its fair share of criticisms, with some believing that the side quests came off being very poor and that regions were not that creative, which in turn made the gameplay uninteresting. Unanimously, all critics found that the story was mostly the weakest point of the whole game, in contrast to the Japanese point of view. The story was considered to be confusing and inessential to the game when it came to the different time periods, and it was mostly a disaster that went bad at almost every turn, which often overshadowed its good points. The characters mostly came off as boring, weak, and not interesting, as all of the protagonists don't have something different and unique from each other because they all have the same goal to save Lightning and to bring her back, whereas antagonists like Caius Ballad has a motive which was clear as day and not that creative to reflect his overall character. Overall, they found that the game focused too much on the less interesting characters over Lightning and Caius, who are mostly the center of attention throughout the whole tale, and the story was mostly insubstantial and semi-coherent, which missed several emotional notes that mostly occurred throughout the first half of the game. In the end, the gameplay was mostly the winner of praise, while the story was seen as a pale attempt to successfully progress the story in a strong direction, much like the original Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII 2 would go on to sell nearly 3.5 million copies worldwide, almost half of Final Fantasy XIII's overall sales. It became another commercial success with the less number of resources used in its development, and the fact that both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions used only a single disc, where most of the game was rendered in real time then using so many pre-rendered cutscenes that were done in the original game, was extremely impressive. Most of the sales were attributed to the PlayStation 3, as the Xbox 360 version has not broken over 1 million units ever since its launch, further proving the Xbox platforms being mostly essential to Western gamers in mind. Just like its predecessor, a Windows version for Steam was made available worldwide in December 2014, while an iOS and Android version were made exclusively in Japan in September 2015. Sales for the iOS and Android versions are not fully disclosed, but the Windows version on Steam broke over 330,000 units since early 2016. If players were not satisfied with the whole game, they could make use of downloadable content that Square Enix made available for Final Fantasy XIII 2. Most of the downloadable content ranges from weapons, costumes, accessories, battles, and exclusive scenarios that can be obtained by various means like pre-ordering or through special events on social networking sites like Facebook, or they can be bought from the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live Marketplace. On the weapons side, Sarah has 3 bow swords, and Noel has 2 dual-blade weapons, with some of them having their own buffs, such as restoring a wielder's hit points, recharging their ATB gauge at a much faster pace, and so on. Each of their weapons can be upgraded into 3 stronger levels at a player's leisure, since weapons and accessories can be grinded much like the original game. Outfits are another thing in the form of DLC, as some of them are original creations to reflect job types from past games, while one for each character is a representation to another franchise outside of Final Fantasy. For instance, Sarah and Noel have the N7 armor, which was worn by Commander Shepard in Mass Effect 3 from BioWare and Electronic Arts, while Noel has the Assassin's Lineage outfit worn by Ezio de Auditore from Assassin's Creed Revelations by Ubisoft. Sarah also has a costume resembling the outfit worn by the J-pop idol Yuka Oshima, since she was one of the playtesters in the game. Mog also has a wardrobe of 16 different costumes to choose from, but they don't have any significant bonuses in battle. Accessories done through DLC have their own bonuses, but they are included by different means, such as the mini soundtrack and in Famitsu Weekly Issue number 1203 in Japan. Coliseum battles have players going up against familiar faces from past games in Final Fantasy XIII, such as Omega and Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V, Lightning, Lieutenant Amodar, and Jill Nabat from Final Fantasy XIII, Ultros and Typhon from Final Fantasy VI, and a group of aliens called Pew Pews who appear in Final Fantasy VIII. Defeating these bosses will grant them as optional tamed monsters to act as Sarah and Noel's third ally in whatever paradigm shift they use. Finally, scenarios done as DLC have a significant aspect to the story as they help tie some loose ends or look up on characters that were put through cameo roles such as Saz Katzroy. Speaking of Saz, his scenario involves him going through an adventure in the amusement park and casino palace called Serendipity after he and Dodge get separated after being sucked into a vortex caused by a paradox while floating through the Historia Crux. In Snow's case, he enters the Void Beyond and uses his Eidolon Shiva to enter the Colosseum, where Sarah challenges him to show how strong she has become on her journey through time. Lastly, Lightning Scenario has her as the only playable character with her own unique jobs to her paradigm system, and it tells how Lightning went into crystal stasis at the end of the game. While it would be the last piece of downloadable content to be released, the ending of that scenario explaining what Lightning did after Sarah's death, and how the game ended on a cliffhanger, left many knowing that a third game set in the Lightning saga was inevitably going to happen. The ending of Final Fantasy XIII-2 and the DLC scenario based on Lightning left many gamers and fans knowing that a third game was not out of the picture, so it would only be a matter of time when that announcement would be officially made. What they did not know was that a third game was already being conceived with many possible concepts during Final Fantasy XIII-2's development as possible continuations of the story and universe of the games, albeit no decision to make a second sequel was made at the time. After the release of the Final Story DLC episode in Final Fantasy XIII-2, Motomu Toriyama felt that the canonical ending for the game and the DLC scenario did not provide a satisfactory ending for Lightning, so development for a third game went well underway in May 2012. While it would make sense for it to go under the name Final Fantasy XIII-3 as some may speculate, Toriyama wanted the sequels in the Lightning saga to stand independent from each other. Ergo, the third game would be officially titled Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. This decision to call it that was because one of the key story concepts behind the game was the quote-unquote rebirth of Lightning as a character after she went into crystal stasis at the end of the previous game, and it was also based on the desire for the team to attract new players to the series. Motomu Toriyama would return to direct this last installment while Yoshinori Kitase returned as the lead producer, Tetsuya Nomura designing the faces of the characters while Toshiyuki Idahana from Final Fantasy IX provided Light's costume designs, Daisuke Watanabe would return as the scenario writer, and Isamu Kamikokurio would once again be the art director. Masashi Hamauzu returned with Naoshi Mitsuda and Mitsudo Suzuki to provide the soundtrack, but Yoshiki Kashitani would not return as the designer and programmer, as those directorial duties were given to Yuji Abe and Naoki Hamaguchi respectively. Yoshitaka Amano would not provide the title logo illustration like he did for both Final Fantasy XIII and XIII-2, as it ended up being more generic and without the presence of Amano's heroin chic style of art. Tri-Ace would assist the development team once more for Lightning Returns creation, but they only returned to help out with the graphics. For making this the last game in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, the team sought out to make it the last one on 7th generation consoles before the arrival of the 8th generation of gaming, so they were given a shorter amount of time than Final Fantasy XIII-2's development. Yoshinori Kitase explained the reason for the shorter time was because the team did not want players to forget the story of the previous games, and the team would need to work especially hard to bring closure to the overall trilogy. The concept of Lightning Returns story progression became termed as quote-unquote world-driven, a concept whereby the world the player interacted with moved independently of their actions. For example, non-playable characters would appear in different locations depending on the time of day, and this concept gave rise to the game having a time limit, which was suggested by the game's battle designer, Yuji Abe, after having read of the Doomsday Clock. Another inspiration behind the story pacing and time limit was from the 2011 movie In Time that starred Justin Timberlake and Amanda Seyfried. The open world aspect was heavily inspired by Bethesda's The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and some of the hard-edge gameplay ideas were borrowed from the Dark Souls franchise by From Software. The majority of the hardcore gaming elements were trimmed out so that the game could eventually become accessible to newcomers. When it came to the assets used in Lightning Returns, very little from the previous two games were reused, as the team decided to build a large portion of the game from scratch, especially when it came to its overworld design and NPC behaviors. To achieve this world-driven aspect, and the direction that the team wanted to go in, the Crystal Tools engine would be used once more, but it went through a major overhaul as it was not originally designed for open-world games. In contrast to the previous two games, a lot of the game's cutscenes were created while the game was still in development, as many placeholder objects and models had to be used until the final assets could be put into place. Because the team was mostly using new assets to create the game, the various continents took longer to create than the environments in Final Fantasy XIII-2, and story scenes sometimes needed to be redone as the game's overall plot had yet to be finalized when development began. The voice actors, in contrast to the normal procedure doing their performances first, and those being used to create the game characters' facial expressions, recorded their lines for the characters well after the various cutscenes had been created. To keep up with the dark atmosphere seen in Final Fantasy XIII-2, the art team decided to stray away from the surrealism aspect as they looked more into cultural and architectural influences from the Middle East, Asia, and London during the Industrial Revolution, and Isamu Kamikokurio managed to conceive the dying world of Nova Crystallia as a result. Nova Crystallia was originally conceived as one island, but as development advanced, the world grew into a four-island configuration. Areas like Luxurion and Yusnan were inspired by Paris, France, and Las Vegas, Nevada, whereas the Dead Dunes and Wildlands were influenced by Cairo, Egypt, and Costa Rica in Central America. Southern Europe was also drawn for inspiration, but it wouldn't be used until the very end of the game. The world's open design was mostly inspired by MMORPGs like Final Fantasy XI, which Yuji Abe described as a tourist guide style. Certain ideas for Final Fantasy XIII's battle system were going to be used, but were omitted due to technical limitations, and problems implementing those desired features in a party-based battle system were prevented from being used in that game. What re-emerged during Lightning Returns development as one of the new aspects was the creative freedom to change Light's appearance within and outside of battle, so reducing the battle party to only a single character opened up the memory space necessary to accommodate those ideas they originally wanted. The time limit sprang from the story concept of a world with a set time to live, and it was a feature that many considered to be new and fresh, as others felt it was completely taboo in role-playing games. It would not be uncommon of a feature, as the original PlayStation game, Valkyrie Profile, incorporated that same element without the gameplay flowing in real time. Just like the previous two games in the Lightning Saga trilogy, Lightning Returns would be marketed in all regions from around the world, although it would not be as substantial like the others. Rumors about the second sequel's existence started even before Final Fantasy XIII-2's release. A domain name was registered under the name Final Fantasy XIII-3 that started this rumor, but it turned out that the domain was registered by Square Enix's Western branch without the Japanese branch's knowledge. After Final Fantasy XIII-2's cliffhanger ending became common knowledge, the game's creators released an initial statement saying that the ending was meant to prepare fans for coming DLC packets that would expand upon the overall story. After the release of the last piece of story DLC, the company then made an official statement saying that they would be releasing future content related to Final Fantasy XIII, since the DLC packets of what was already released for Final Fantasy XIII-2 were not that well received as Square Enix had hoped for. By August 2012, during the run-up to a special 25th anniversary commemoration event for the Final Fantasy franchise, a teaser site titled A Storm Gathers was released, with Square Enix sticking to their promise on new developments for the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy and its main protagonist, Lightning. Finally, the game itself was unveiled at the event, with Motomo Toriyama, Isamu Kamikokurio, Yuji Abe, and Yoshinori Kitase detailing the core concepts of the game. Because character dialogue varied due to the time of day in the game, the Western release for the game was delayed by over 2 months after its Japanese release because there was far more translation, dubbing work, and lip-syncing than the previous entries. On the promotion and marketing side of the game, the development team rethought their strategy by working more closely with Yohei Murakami, the publicity and marketing agent for many of Square Enix's games. Lightning Returns was heavily promoted at gaming events during 2013, along with Lightning and various monsters from Final Fantasy XIII being featured in a series of player events in the main series' 14th installment with its reboot release. When it came to DLC done for Final Fantasy XIII-2, they were mostly mixed, with the costumes generally receiving the most praise, regardless of some complaints with them being too cosmetic, but the presence of story DLC caused many to criticize the game as being mostly incomplete. In response to this, the developers decided to package the entire story of Lightning Returns in the retail edition, but downloadable content still came for the game, which mostly were bonus costumes for Lightning. One of these would be the clothing, weapon, and equipment of Cloud Strife from Final Fantasy VII that had the game's victory fanfare, and Lightning performing Cloud's victory pose after winning a battle. Yuna's costume from Final Fantasy X was made as a bonus for those who picked up Final Fantasy X and X-2 HD Remaster on the PlayStation 3 or PlayStation Vita, while it would be a pre-order bonus for a worldwide audience through Amazon. Additional DLC costumes would release after the game came out, and a free DLC pack was made for the Western version that can implement Japanese voice acting and lip syncing if players were not too fond of the English dub of past installments. It was free for the first 2 weeks, but became paid downloadable content afterwards. For the release of the game in each territory, Japan put out a special edition of the game called Final Fantasy XIII Lightning Ultimate Box that included all the games in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy on the PlayStation 3, a PlayArts Kai figurine of Lightning in the third game, a 3-disc special soundtrack, an artworks book of Lightning throughout the series, and a special stand for the whole package. A special Hori controller was also accompanied with the game's release. In North America, a collector's edition for the game was only exclusive through the Square Enix online store that included an 80-page art book with a dust jacket featuring Lightning's original drawings done by Tetsuya Nomura with a foreword from Isamu Kamikoka Ryo, a silver-embossed pocket watch inspired by the game's theme that revolves around a countdown doomsday clock, and DLC based on the outfits for both Cloud Strife and Aerith Gainsborough in Final Fantasy VII. GameStop was also selling a special PlayStation 3 DualShock 3 wireless controller themed on Lightning Returns, after it was first announced for the Asian markets. The PAL territories were more limited with their releases, as they got a limited edition steelbook which included a DLC token to give European players access to the Cloud Strife costume and Buster Sword DLC, and both a Nordic limited edition and Lightning Samurai Set Nordic edition that featured different DLC packs. The Asian territories received a limited edition DualShock 3 controller which was standalone, but became a bundle pack with that controller and the Chinese-Korean version of the game. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII was completed in a little over a year, and it would release in Japan on November 21, 2013, and in North America, Europe, and Australia in February 2014. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII is set 500 years after the ending of Final Fantasy XIII-2, taking place in the year 1000 AF. In the game before, Sarah Farron sets out on a journey with Noel Christ to correct the distortions and paradoxes in the timeline, and to reunite with her sister while the people construct a new cocoon, since the old one is destined to collapse. Unknowingly, the protagonists end up instigating the death of Vetro, which allows the chaos to spill into the mortal world to bring about end times for Grand Pulse. Sarah ends up dying, which causes Lightning to lose hope, but she reassures her older sister by her spirit to keep that hope alive, which prompts Light to enter crystal stasis and preserve her sister's memory. Lightning Returns would be set in this new present time with only 13 days being left of the world's existence. Because of the unleashing of the chaos, the world of Grand Pulse has been consumed, leaving only a set of islands making up the land of Nova Crystallia. The new cocoon called Bunavelza, named after the key deity of the game's universe, acts as the world's moon. The chaos has halted human aging, and no new children are born due to Etro's death, which causes the human population to stagnate and shrink. Over the intervening centuries, two opposing religions have formed and dominate the life of Nova Crystallia: the Order of Salvation, who worship Bunavelza, and the rebel cult who worship the goddess called the Children of Vetro. Nova Crystallia is divided into 4 regions, with one being the city of Luxerion, a capital of worship, whose people are loyal to the Order, the pleasure capital of Yusnan, a city of revelry where people live in a constant state of celebration, the Dead Dunes, a desert area dominated by ruins, and the Wildlands, an untamed area where the human city of Academia used to stand, as it also houses the remains of Valhalla, the capital of Vetro. Within the new cocoon is the Ark, a zone where time is frozen, and where Lightning conducts her base of operations to fulfill her mission. Lightning would return as the game's main protagonist, solo playable character, and narrator of the whole tale. Her reappearance before the end of days has many people, including her allies, labeling her as a martyr and goddess of death because of this impending doom. However, it is her job to lead everyone into a new world based on Bunavelza's wish, but she is only doing this as she wants to save Sarah from being trapped in the realm of death. Her job as the savior would reflect her default design, as many may consider Lightning to be similar to that of a Valkyrie in Norse mythology, further stipulating similarities between this game and Valkyrie Profile. The other main characters from the previous games also make appearances, such as Hope Estime aiding Lightning in her mission, as his appearance reverts back to what he looked like in Final Fantasy XIII instead of his more adult appearance in the sequel, Snow Villiers, who becomes the leader of Yusnon, and the world's last l'Cie after being devastated by the death of his fiancée Sarah. Vanille and Fang, having been released from their crystal stasis, go their separate ways, with Fang being the leader of a bandit gang from the Dead Dunes called Monoculus, and Vanille being a saint while under constant protection from the Order of Luxurion. Noel Christ becomes a vigilante in Luxurion after feeling guilty over his role in the deaths of both Etro and Sarah that led to the world's current state. Saz Catsroy and his son Dodge reside in the Wildlands, and it becomes home to Mog, Caius Ballad, and Yule after the latter two managed to break their curse, which was Caius's motivation in the previous game. While Bunavelza would be the main deity and main antagonist who chooses Lightning as the world's savior and guide her to complete her mission, a new character is introduced by the name of Lumina, a mysterious near doppelganger of Sarah who both aids and taunts Lightning during her quest. All the voice cast from the previous two games such as Ali Hillis, Troy Baker, Vincent Martella, and many others return for their respective roles, but Jessica DiCicco and Daniel Riordan would voice Lumina and Bunavelza in Lightning Returns, respectively.
You can't say what Sarah would want, even if she weren't dead. Yet you go making up handy lies. She would have wanted you to do this. No, she wouldn't want you to do that. That's just plain dishonest.
Rejoice in the light of God's love. I shall descend and inhabit your frail bodies, to read your heart and bring you joy.
The game begins with Lightning waking up from her crystal stasis by the god Bunavelza after 500 years. The world is set to end in 13 days, and Lightning is made the savior because of the world's impending demise. She must free the souls of humanity from the burdens in their hearts and guide them to a new world that Bunavelza will create after those 13 days are complete. Lightning undertakes this task so that she can rescue and ensure the rebirth of Sarah's spirit. Hope acts as her guide from the Ark that houses the rescued souls of humanity, and Bunavelza chose him for that task as he changes his physical appearance back to his 14-year-old self from Final Fantasy XIII. As she journeys to perform her task, she encounters many of her old allies whom now carry heavy emotional burdens, and Lightning is followed by Lumina, who gives her advice and taunts her at regular intervals. In Luxurion, Lightning investigates a series of murders where all the victims match the physical description of the savior. During her investigation, she is followed by Noel Christ, who has become obsessed with the prophecy that he must kill Light to realize a better world and to reunite with Yule. The two briefly ally together to root the children of Etro, the people responsible for the murders, and the two end up battling each other. Lightning uses Noel's rage to make him realize and accept his mistakes, thus lifting his burden. After this, she meets up with Vanille in the Order's cathedral. Vanille shows Light a place within the cathedral where the souls of the dead have gathered, and she is being prepared for a ritual to take place on the final day that will apparently purify the souls being tortured by the chaos. Vanille hopes to atone for her past actions by taking up this task. Upon her next mission in Yusnon, Light infiltrates Snow's palace and finds him preparing to take in a concentration of the chaos that is contained from within. Having given up hope, he wants to absorb the chaos, become a Seath, and have Lightning kill him to put him out of his misery. Though he goes through with his plan, and for the two of them to fight, Light succeeds in giving Snow a renewed hope of seeing Sarah once more, and she reverses his transformation with the inclusion of lifting his burden. Traveling to the Wildlands, Light saves a white chocobo from monsters and nurses it back to health. The chocobo, who people call the Angel of Valhalla, is actually revealed to be Odin, the same Eidolon who acted as Lightning's ally from the past. By journeying next to Valhalla, Lightning meets up with her old adversary Caius Ballad in multiple versions of Yule. The two warriors battle each other for old time's sake, and Light comes to learn that Caius has become tied to life by the many Yules around him, which prevents him from having his own soul saved. It is also at this point where she learns that it was Yule's perpetual rebirth that caused the chaos to seep into the mortal world that triggered the events of the previous game. By traveling to the Dead Dunes, Lightning encounters Fang and goes with her on a journey through the underground ruins in search of a relic called the Holy Clavis. By the time they locate the relic, Fang reveals that it is the key to the ritual in Luxurion, as it holds the power to draw on the souls of the dead, and that same ritual that Vanille is preparing for will ultimately lead to her death. Fang attempts to try and destroy the Holy Clavis to keep Vanille alive, but the forces of the Order arrive and take it away. On the 11th day, the souls of the dead speak to Lightning through a visage of Cid Raines, who originally appeared in Final Fantasy XIII. He tells her the Order has deceived Vanille and plans to sacrifice her to destroy the dead, so the living will forget their existence and be purified for rebirth in the new world. Lightning knows what must be done to save Vanille, though Sid gives her a warning that she would be defying Bunavel's will if she goes through with this. After returning to the Wildlands, Lightning encounters Saz and finds out that his son Dodge has fallen into a coma, which he is unwilling to wake up from because of his father's current state. Lightning retrieves fragments of Dodge's soul that allows the boy to wake up, and she lifts the burden from Saz's soul. Lastly, Lightning's journey finishes up as she encounters Mog as the leader of the hidden Moogle village, and she helps him fend off attacking monsters. On the final day in Nova Crystallia, Hope reveals to Lightning that Bunavelza used him to watch over her to ensure that she wouldn't stray away from her mission, and the deity will dispose of him now that his task is already complete. After Hope disappears, Lightning is transported back to Luxurion and enters the cathedral with the help of Noel, Snow, and Fang to save Vanille, and Light convinces her to free the souls of the dead. Doing this helps Lightning locate Sarah's soul, as it's kept hidden inside of Lumina for safety, but Bunavelza arrives using Hope as his host to capture everyone except for Lightning. Lightning is then transported to an otherworldly realm by the remorseless deity, where she finally meets him in person, and she learns that he has been using her to replace Etro as the new goddess amongst the world. Lightning states that humanity's future is left to their choice and not by the will of a god or herself, even if she becomes the new goddess. She goes face to face with Bunavelza in battle and wounds him, which helps her free Hope, and prepares to become the new goddess and protect the new world by trapping herself and Bunavelza in the unseen realm. An illusion of Sarah confronts Lightning, revealing Lumina as the physical manifestation of Lightning's suppressed vulnerabilities. Now fully accepting Lumina as a part of herself, Lightning regains her humanity and calls forth the aid with Hope, Snow, Noel, Vanille, Fang, and the Eidolons answer her call as they sever Bunavelza's hold on the souls of humanity, which includes Saz, Dodge, Mog, and a revived Sarah. The souls unite together as one with Lightning, and they all finally defeat Bunavelza for good. In the aftermath of the battle, Caius and the multiple versions of Yule decide to stay in the Unseen Realm and protect the balance between worlds in Etro's stead. However, the final incarnation of Yule alone wishes for a new life, and she is allowed to accompany Lightning and her friends. After the Eidolons and Mog depart for the Unseen Realm, Lightning, her allies, and the souls of humanity travel to the new world where they can decide their own fate and help shape up their own future. Lightning Returns follows the same tradition of its predecessor by offering its additions and updates over the original Final Fantasy XIII. Brought back from Final Fantasy XIII-2 is for Light to interact with non-playable characters and go through regions while viewing everything from a 360-degree camera. The world of Nova Crystallia is rendered to scale with the characters, and Lightning can navigate on foot or ride on the Angel of Valhalla chocobo depending on the area. Quests from non-playable characters make a return as well. Lightning can now sprint on foot for limited periods, climb up ladders, and jump freely as she likes. 3 modes of difficulty are present, with there being easy, normal, and hard mode. The latter mode is unlocked after completing the main game once. The New Game Plus feature makes a return where it functions the same as its predecessor. Since Lightning Returns is run on a time limit, the time it takes for one day to pass is at least 2 to 3 hours on easy mode, while normal and hard modes have a day pass by only 1 hour. The timer will stop during cutscenes, conversations, and battles, but Lightning can also pause time during real-time gameplay by using an ability called Chronostasis. The quests that Lightning can pursue and complete will attribute greatly to her growth in stats, as side quests from the Canvas of Prayers give off small boosts, side quests from non-playable characters will give medium boosts, while ones done in the main story will yield an even larger boost. This makes up for the Crystarium system being completely absent, as the growth of Light's stats and access of abilities are attributed to endgame quests and the different garbs she can wear. Many of the side quests can be obtained during certain times, since the real-time build of the world means non-playable characters are in constant movement, and they only appear at certain places at a given time. Another way to accept quests is for players to locate Chocolina in the Canvas of Prayers, as they are postboards found throughout the 4 main regions of Nova Crystallia. Upon the completion of the quests that are given by non-playable characters, Lightning is given a portion of Aradia, which is spiritual energy retrieved from those whose burdens are lifted. Every day at 6 AM game time, Lightning is summoned back to the Ark to give her gathered Aradia to a tree called Yggdrasil. If she gathered enough Aradia during that whole day, the in-game time limit gets extended by 1 day as a bonus. Lightning can also restock on supplies and collect new equipment such as newer costumes for her to utilize. A feature that was briefly used was the Outer Worlds service, where players can take photos and share them along with their personal stats and battle scores through Facebook and Twitter, but has since been discontinued as of April 2016. When it comes to the in-game battle menu, it too has gone through a revision. The Command Synergy battle system is no longer present, as it has been revised to the style change Active Time battle system. It is a battle system that uses elements of the series' traditional ATB-based paradigm system from the past 2 games, and it bears similarities to the Dress Sphere system featured in Final Fantasy X-2, because of Lightning wearing different outfits. Light has access to several of these garbs with different power sets known as schemata, with one being called a schema. Each garb will have its own separate ATB gauge, and actions from them are mapped onto the controller's face buttons, meaning that the usual menu-style ATB battle system is no longer needed. This allows Lightning to move around the field during battle sequences to a limited degree. A majority of the garbs and their accessories can be purchased from the in-game shops or received upon completing side quests, with stronger garbs, items, shields, and weapons being unlocked in hard mode, as well as the access of more challenging areas and boss fights. Lightning can directly equip 3 schemata while having additional slots for backup costumes, which can be equipped outside of battle. She can be equipped with a close combat weapon such as a sword or a spear, a shield, and a cosmetic accessory. The color scheme of each garb can also be customized to the player's liking, using both a preset and custom color, and certain options become available to alter both specific portions and all portions of certain garbs. Just like Final Fantasy XIII, enemies appear in the open field and can be avoided or engaged. Their numbers will increase during nighttime, and their strength and ability to deal damage will grow as more days in the in-game clock pass by. When killing all standard versions of an enemy, a final version known as the last one of that particular species will make its appearance as a boss, and defeating it will earn Lightning a high reward, along with the inclusion of making that enemy type extinct throughout the rest of the game. Either Light attacking the enemy or vice versa will make the battle start, but attacking the enemy in the open field will make them lose a portion of their hit points, as well as Lightning if the enemy attacks her first. While Light performs attacks, her ATB meter will constantly drain, as she must switch between her selected garbs to make the previously selected one to recharge, so that they can be used in the same battle once more. Light can use her short-ranged weapons to do physical attacks, while her magic is mostly long-ranged. On top of that, players can use the guard ability to minimize the damage taken from enemies, but executing a successful parry with guard at the precise time will fully negate any damage received. The chain gauge makes a return, as doing more damage to enemies will cause them to stagger, which will lower their defenses by a significant margin. Energy points are another thing introduced in Lightning Returns, and they can be used to perform special moves or activate abilities such as Kiraga to fully heal Light's hit points, Overclock, which will slow down time on the enemies for Lightning to land more hits, and Army of One as being one of her signature moves to do massive damage. After winning many battles, Lightning will gain the in-game currency of Gil, which was done in Final Fantasy XIII too, and a portion of her energy point gauge is refilled. Unlike easy mode, if Lightning flees or dies in battle during normal or hard mode, then 1 in-game hour is lost on the clock. After each battle, Lightning's hit points are not completely refilled unlike the previous 2 games, so the need of healing items that can be bought from merchants and shops will make up for not having full health at the beginning of each battle, and no auto-battle mode is present, as everything is done through manual-based commands from players. If players opt in for easy mode, Lightning's health can regenerate if she stands idle. In contrast to its predecessors being generally positive in their reception, Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII faced a more mixed response from both gamers and critics upon its release. Most of the praise was given to the game's battle system, as many thought it was fun and felt like Final Fantasy in its purest form, as this game came off as an energetic, modern approximation of its original combat structure. Plus, the customization between different garbs and schemata gave many different possibilities when in battle, since Lightning is the only playable character, and the enemies can be tricky in any difficulty mode they play in. Regardless of the praise within the game's battle system, the graphics and game story received mixed reviews, while the quest gameplay was heavily criticized. While the main cast and many environments were praised, some felt that textures within the environments, the non-playable characters, and lack of personality within the different regions made the game feel like it was left unfinished. The story felt extremely underwhelming, as there was little development of Lightning's character, and the overall narrative remained unfixed, as Square Enix did not address that problem, which was seen in the previous 2 outings of the Lightning saga. Although certain side quests and dialogue did help brighten up Lightning's character.
That's
You're
more
just
like
a
the
mean
old
old
Mog.
witch.
Don't give up. Things are going to get better.
When it came to the in-game quests, many felt that they were playing in the opening hours of an MMORPG, with many of the tasks done in-game being completely dull and uncreative, and the use of the in-game clock did not stimulate an encapsulating experience, as it collided with almost every other aspect in the game since it put players under pressure to complete so many quests at once. The shortcomings were far more extended than what was seen in the previous two games, but some still come under the impression that it remains an underrated entry that actually does more justice to Final Fantasy XIII because of certain improvements making the game more enjoyable. Others feel that because of its overabundance of problems, the game did not feel like a high-quality product that met Square Enix's standards when it came to Final Fantasy games done in high definition. Lightning Return's Final Fantasy XIII would go on and sell almost 1.5 million copies worldwide, as many viewed the game as a financial disappointment between both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 platforms. The reason for this was because the game launched at the end of the life cycle of the 7th generation consoles in Japan, while North America, Europe, and Australia saw the game launch after the release of both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, where the former was already garnering mass appeal toward a worldwide audience. This is very common for newer games releasing near or after the end of a console's life cycle, as they tend to suffer from a depreciation of sales. However, Shinji Hashimoto from Square Enix has come out and claimed that the overall sales met the company's expectations, and they were happy with the final product. Both Motomu Toriyama and Yoshinori Kitase did not come off being surprised at the reception that the game was receiving, as they expected the game's time limit was going to be the cause of most of its criticism, something that they anticipated with what was going to happen. After the game's initial launch on both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, Lightning Returns also saw a release on the Windows platform through Steam on December 10th, 2015, and an iOS and Android port being made exclusive in Japan in February 2016. Just like the iOS and Android port of both Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XIII-2, the total sales have not been disclosed by Square Enix, but the Steam version of Lightning Returns has since moved over 150,000 units. Since the original game released in late 2009, and with it having a pair of sequels that came afterwards, the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy has proven to be a surprising success for Square Enix by moving nearly 12 million copies combined and generating over $1 billion in overall revenue for the company. While none of those surpassed the number of sales between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII combined, the number of overall sales was an impressive effort for a trilogy of games. In a similar vein to the series of novellas done for the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, the Lightning Saga had its own share of novellas that brought about more stories that took place before, during, and after the events of all three games. The first of these novellas to arrive would be called Final Fantasy XIII Episode 0, Promise, and most of the tales of the main cast are told through the 13 days before the Purge that started in the original game. A couple of audio dramas were released for this novella with the original voice cast in Japanese reprising their roles for their specific characters. The next novella to release would be Final Fantasy XIII Side Story, A Dreaming Cocoon Falls into the Dawn, and it mostly featured the experiences of side characters like those from the paramilitary group Nora, and exclusive characters to the story, while Lightning's group is having their subsequent journey as Pulseless Sea. Next up to release in the series of novellas would be Final Fantasy XIII Episode 1, where it acts as an epilogue after the events of the original game, and leads up to Final Fantasy XIII-2, where Lightning is taken into Valhalla 700 AF. Final Fantasy XIII-2 Fragments Before was the next novella to release, as it takes place before Sarah's journey to find Lightning, and several stories revolve around her, Snow, Noel, Rigdia, and Hope's father Bartholomew Estime. Its sequel novel, Final Fantasy XIII-2 Fragments After, came out a short time later, and it focused on tying up loose ends in that game's plot, where they focus on Lightning, Snow, Noel, Alyssa, and Yule. To coincide with the release of the third game in the trilogy, a novella was planned to release as Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, Chronicle of a Chaotic Era. The overall plot is set during the 500-year time span between the release of the Chaos into the mortal realm and the arrival of the Savior, and its main focus is to have been a drama of people struggling against despair in a world eroded by chaos, as Lightning Returns' main theme is to stand up against destiny. The stories in this novella would revolve around Snow, Noel, and Hope, with how they ended up what they become in the game that was soon to follow. Unfortunately, the novella would end up being cancelled due to reasons that are unknown. Finally, the last novella to release would be Final Fantasy XIII, Reminiscence, Tracer of Memories, and it stars a journalist named Aidi who forms up interviews with the main cast of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy and the Latin memories of their past lives before ending up in the new world. Unlike the other novellas written by other novelists, the final one was planned and written by both Motomu Toriyama and Daisuke Watanabe, and it is set between the end of Lightning Returns to the epilogue full-motion video seen in the post-credits sequence. Most of these novellas would be made available through the Japanese gaming publication Famitsu, while some others were made specifically for the trilogy's Ultimanias, pre-order bonuses, and collector's editions that were available in Japan, as the two that were based on Final Fantasy XIII-2 were the only ones available through commercial retail. Even though the novellas are exclusive in Japan, English fan translations of the novellas have been made available for people to read for themselves if they are fully interested in the overall lore within the Lightning Saga. Final Fantasy XIII is one of Square Enix's most important entries in their flagship franchise, whose overall success stemmed from a result of undesirable circumstances. The original game gave birth to a new mythology where separate games were to be made under different teams, with specific key members for a new generation of hardware. As a result of this transition, a lot of the publicly released information regarding their level of involvement between the other games and mostly Final Fantasy XIII should not all be taken at face value. Keep in mind, this new initiative came during a time when so many people and legacy members who left the Final Fantasy team were departing Square Enix to become freelance or to set up their new companies, so it would have been in their best interest to take as much credit as possible on every little thing that they worked on, even if it meant stretching the truth at times. Meanwhile, the team members who stayed on board with Final Fantasy XIII were not in a position where they could speak freely upon the claims that others were making. The final product was still a visually incredible game with average gameplay that some may say is worthy to live up to the Final Fantasy name, but it was hampered by releasing far behind schedule due to the lack of a unified vision and making the game a multi-platform release midway through its development, which greatly affected its long-term sales. While those numbers and direct change to make the game a multi-platform release did not really matter to all the people who still enjoyed the game, those factors would still have a significant influence on the game's potential audience. Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Lightning Returns both had a tighter and even more minimal development history, mainly due to each game having subpar and mediocre stories attached to the overall narrative, a big push to apply more Western development techniques instead of being true to their own development methods from themselves, and constant management interference that resulted in a pair of sequels that faced backlash from fans of both Sony and Microsoft. Players' expectations and the standards for video game development have become more demanding over the years, and given the troubled history of 3 games being made as a trilogy over one particular game, the possibility of there being a 4th game starring Lightning and her friends is bound to become a much more difficult proposition for Square Enix overall. When all the games in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy were released, the overall development spanned for 10 years across 3 different platforms. During this lengthy development cycle, many current and legacy members of the development team at Square Enix bared witness to the rise of development costs between game platforms. Before, the development costs were minimal, meaning their earlier games were easily profitable with only a few artists and programmers. The team for the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy's development consisted of at least between 200 to 400 overall members, which is incredibly large when compared to the current standards of having at least 100 to 200 people on a team. Being forever part of Japan's gaming portfolio, the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy is forever destined to be compared to the country's other role-playing games, which have come out and surpassed all 3 games in terms of critical and commercial success, and are now being viewed as the leading innovators. Even its predecessor, Final Fantasy VII, would continue to be iterated throughout the years by a number of newer projects done by its original team and other developers. While this surely had more to do with the stronger market value of Final Fantasy VII from all over the world, it would still inspire a number of iterations that continue to use elements from the original PlayStation game's template, including a full-on high-definition multi-part remake announced at E3 2015. Once again, Final Fantasy XIII has become a victim of undesirable circumstances, because it is no longer believed it has the audience it needs to remain relevant. Although Lightning is still considered one of the generally well-received female protagonists in video game history, Final Fantasy XIII no longer has the recognizable status amongst the other games in the series, whether if they are driven by female characters or otherwise. The possibility of there being a brand new game in the main series returning to its roots has always been brought forward to Square Enix, but they have remained by their word of evolving the series with new styles and newer installments. Any new game they work on would always have to be made that will be streamlined with the times, and to challenge everything done in every installment from a conventional sense. But while Square Enix still values the franchise from a traditional sense, a new game in the form of a spiritual successor such as the Bravely Default games and the recently released Octopath Traveler are not enough to insatiate fans who would rather see a new traditional Final Fantasy game done as a mainline installment on consoles. Even though Square Enix has said in the past that more of their newer games in the series must be more action-oriented and fast-paced when they are being worked on by the many different teams, there are many who feel that it makes a bit less sense where they live in a world which they already have Star Ocean and Kingdom Hearts. However, it doesn't mean that a Final Fantasy game done with more real-time action elements is not acceptable in some form or another. The Final Fantasy franchise has gone through multiple transformations with every installment throughout the years, as they have changed visions between different teams and different designers throughout all of its known existence. So it's just a matter of time before the right team comes along with bringing about the right vision. History has shown that as long as there are those who still value any particular installment of the Final Fantasy franchise, there will always be an audience yearning for more, meaning that Lightning and her friends will someday make their return. Next time in RRPG's Final Fantasy Retrospective, the next installment sees Square Enix returning to the MMORPG format for their 14th iteration. While the original release would greatly damage the Final Fantasy brand, it would go through a heavy revamp, which would see its re-release as the new face of massive multiplayer online role-playing games for both Square Enix and the video game industry.